Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It was well over a decade ago when this happened, and I can still recall every detail so vividly, yet there's something about it I can never quite shake off. It feels like the whole situation holds some invisible weight, something dark, just waiting to spill out whenever I think about it. I've tried telling this story to a few people, just a couple really, but every time, it comes out wrong. They never seem to understand. Maybe I'm not telling it right, or maybe the malice I felt in that moment can't be conveyed with words alone. It's a feeling, a tension in the air that's difficult to put into context, but I'll do my best to explain. Back then, I lived in a small ground-floor apartment. It was one of those older complexes where each unit had a door opening straight to the outside, and there was always that quiet hum in the neighborhood. It wasn't a busy place, not even a little. A peaceful spot, almost too peaceful at times. But peace can be deceiving, as I would come to realize that night. I had always been a terrible sleeper. If I laid down around midnight, I'd usually fall asleep somewhere around 2 in the morning. It was just how it worked for me, and honestly, it had been a rare night when I'd actually managed to fall asleep quickly. So when I was jolted awake at some ungodly hour, my mind raced and groggily I tried to figure out what had happened. It was a crash, sharp and sudden, ringing through the air like the sound of metal slamming against something hard. It came from the kitchen, just beyond the thin walls of my bedroom. At first, I thought maybe it was my cats. They had a habit of running around the apartment, sometimes knocking things off shelves or making a mess. But as soon as I tried to move to get out of bed, something caught me off guard. My cats, both of them, were laying on the bed, pressed against me, their bodies stiff with fear. They were wide-eyed, their pupils dilated so much that they looked like two black holes against the white of their eyes. Their ears were flattened, their fur puffed up like they had just been shocked. And I've seen them startled before. Cats get scared, right? But never like this. Not like this. I froze. I couldn't move. Not because I was scared. I guess I was, but it was more than that. It was a deep, primal feeling. Something wasn't right. My cats, normally so laid back, were completely unnerved by something, and that bothered me more than the noise. A quick glance at the clock told me it was around 3:30 in the morning. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't a simple accident. For a few seconds, I just stared at them, trying to make sense of what was going on. The cats weren't moving, and neither was I. But the crash from the kitchen, the noise, it echoed through my skull. I had to know what happened. With some reluctance, I finally managed to pull the blanket off myself, slipping out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. I didn't think about what I was doing, about the lack of a weapon or any real preparation. I just acted. The only thing I knew for sure was that whatever had happened, it wasn't normal, and I wasn't going to sit around wondering about it. I padded down the dark hall towards the kitchen. The apartment was still, all but for the slight buzz of the refrigerator. The silence was thick, suffocating even, and as I reached for the light switch near the doorframe, I hesitated for just a moment. I had no real reason to be scared, but that strange, primal unease hadn't left me. In the back of my mind, I half expected to see someone standing in the doorway. The thought made me grit my teeth and flick the switch. The light came on with a soft pop, and I was hit with the sight of the mess in front of me. I hadn't expected anything like this. My kitchen was small, cramped even. The sink sat across from the stove, and there was barely enough room to turn around without bumping into something. The dish rack, which had been tucked neatly next to the sink before I went to bed, was now scattered across the floor. I don't know what I expected. Maybe a broken dish, something that had simply tipped over, but that wasn't what I found. The dish drainer was on the far side of the kitchen, right by the stove, and it had been thrown with some considerable force. It was clear that it hadn't just tipped over. No, it had been launched, hurled across the room with such power that it had hit the stove with a loud crash. The bowl that had been in the rack earlier shattered. The silverware was strewn across the floor, and the dish towel that had been resting on the counter had only made it halfway before it landed right in the middle of the room, crumpled up like it had been tossed aside in a hurry. My first thought was that I had somehow missed something. Maybe there was a logical explanation, like a draft or some kind of force that caused the rack to slide. But no, It was impossible to deny that this was no accident. Something had made this happen, something powerful enough to fling the dish drainer across the room like it was nothing. I couldn't make sense of it. I stared at the mess, trying to process it. I wasn't angry anymore. That had quickly faded, replaced with confusion, fear, and something else, something darker that I couldn't name. I bent down, carefully picking up the pieces of the broken dish and gathering the scattered silverware. My hands were trembling as I worked quickly, shoving everything back into the dish rack. I didn't want to be in that kitchen any longer than I had to be. I could feel the tension thick in the air, and it felt as though something was watching me, as if the very space around me was holding its breath. Once the mess was cleaned up, I moved the dish rack back onto the counter, and just as quickly as I had entered the room, I turned off the light and returned to my bed. The cats were still there, huddled together against my side. Their fear hadn't fully subsided, but they weren't as frantic as before. I lay down next to them, still trying to shake off the feeling of unease. My mind raced with questions, with thoughts that kept spinning in circles, never quite landing on anything that made sense. I must have fallen back to sleep at some point, though it wasn't a restful sleep. It was broken, fitful, filled with strange dreams that I could never quite recall once I woke up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that I was still missing something crucial. The next morning, the sunlight streamed in through the window, casting long shadows across the room. I groggily made my way into the kitchen, still wondering if the events of the night before had been some sort of bizarre dream. I didn't want to believe it had happened, but I couldn't deny the mess I'd left behind. And there it was, just as I had left it, the dish drainer, the broken bowl, the silverware scattered across the floor. Nothing had moved. It was all exactly where I'd left it in the middle of the night. I wanted to shrug it off, tell myself I'd imagined the whole thing, but deep down I knew better. My cats hadn't imagined it either. They had felt it too. That lingering presence, the sense of something watching, something not right. And no amount of rationalization could make it go away. I never figured it out. No, I stopped trying to make sense of it after a while. I couldn't. I was raised to be skeptical, to always search for a logical explanation. But there was none. No rational explanation for the way the dish drainer had been thrown across the room. No reason for my cats to have been so terrified. No way to explain the feeling of palpable malice that hung in the air long after the incident was over. To this day, I don't know what happened. Maybe it was something I couldn't explain, something outside my understanding. But the weight of that night has stayed with me. It hasn't left me, and I can still feel that sense of dread when I close my eyes and think back to it. There was nothing supernatural about it, nothing ghostly or otherworldly. It was just real, and it was unsettling in a way that nothing else has ever matched. I've long since moved out of that apartment, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night and the silence stretches too far, I think about it. About that night. About the malice that seemed to fill the air. And though I'll never have an answer, I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it didn't want me there. I graduated college in the spring, and after a few months of applying to jobs and getting no real bites, I decided to take the first job I was offered. It was a morning cleaning position at the local movie theater. The hours were early, 4 a.m. to 10 a.m., but it seemed like it'd be an easy gig. I could work on my own, throw on some music, and get paid. I figured it would help me save up a little bit while I looked for something more permanent. The guy who interviewed me was a scruffy dude named Jeff. He wasn't anything special to look at, just a middle-aged guy with a rough demeanor, wearing a faded band t-shirt and a pair of jeans that looked like they hadn't seen a wash in a while. He asked the usual questions about availability and willingness to clean up after messes, even the occasional vomit, which seemed odd to me, but I brushed it off. What stuck out though was the last question he asked. "Do you scare easy?" I laughed, thinking it was a joke. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm good with anything." He stared at me for a moment, his eyes kind of narrowing. Then he nodded, as if he was satisfied with my answer. "Good," he said. "You'll need it." The job itself wasn't bad at first. It was simple work, sweeping up popcorn, scrubbing sticky soda stains off the floors, taking out the trash. The early mornings meant the theater was mostly empty except for me. I'd plug in my iPod, listen to music, and get through the work as quickly as possible. Most of the time, I was alone on my shift, which suited me just fine. The layout of the theater was strange at first. It had a T-shape, with the lobby and bathrooms in the stem, and the smaller theaters to the left, and the larger IMAX screens to the right. The projection area ran above the hallway, a long, narrow corridor with a couple of small offices, and all the projector equipment. Every morning, I'd be the first one there, and my task was to go upstairs and turn on the lights in the theaters. The lights in the building were mostly automatic, but the projectors in smaller rooms had manual switches, so I'd have to go up and turn them on before anyone else arrived. That wasn't a huge deal, except for the fact that the theater was pitch black when I arrived. The building, even though it was fairly new, always felt off, especially when all the lights were off. The projection room was full of movie posters and cardboard cutouts of actors, which, when all the lights were off, looked like a sea of people standing in the dark. I'd walk through that hall, turning on lights, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. One morning, I was talking with Jeff when he brought up something that made my stomach turn. Apparently, several women had complained about a tall, thin man in a suit who would follow them from theater to theater. They described him as wearing a black suit, complete with a bowler hat, and walking slowly after them, even into the bathrooms. It wasn't just one or two complaints. It was frequent enough that the police had been called a few times. The day staff started calling him the tall man. I didn't think much of it at the time. It seemed a bit ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. And then there was Theater 5. Theater 5 was the one nobody wanted to clean. I didn't understand why at first, but soon I started hearing rumors about it. The theater was tucked away behind the bathrooms, down a long hallway, so it was isolated. People said that being back there, especially at 4 a.m. when the building was completely still, gave off a weird vibe. Those who worked there complained about nosebleeds, headaches, and the sense that they were being watched. I had to clean it on my second shift, and I instantly felt uneasy. The theater itself wasn't all that different from the others, but the hallway leading to it was dark and narrow, and I had to walk down it alone to get there. Every time I cleaned it, I felt like something was behind me watching. Once, while I was sweeping, I heard footsteps. I froze. It was fast, like someone running. I looked up, but I didn't see anyone. Then, a blur of movement caught my eye. A little blonde-haired boy turning the corner and running down the hallway. I dropped my broom, heart racing, and chased after him. I ran through the hallway, out into the lobby, but there was no sign of him. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. Jeff was standing outside by the front entrance, smoking. I walked up to him, still shaken, and asked, "Who was that kid?" He looked at me, confused for a moment, then laughed. "Oh, so you met Charlie, huh?" Charlie was apparently another entity, one that had been reported by customers. A blonde-haired boy who liked to run around Theater 5 during the movies, causing a ruckus. When an usher would go to check on him, he'd vanish. The staff started calling him Charlie, after the boy from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. But the thing was, no one had ever seen Charlie with the tall man. We all joked that Charlie was the tall man's son, but no one really knew. It wasn't until later that Jeff admitted that some people had seen and heard things in the theater. He didn't go into detail, but he didn't deny that the place had a reputation for being haunted. The theater was only a few years old, but it had a strange vibe. It was built on what used to be wetlands, and according to some of the older locals, the land had once belonged to a family that sold it off in the 1980s. There was no historical evidence to suggest anything bad had happened there, but it didn't stop people from whispering about the place being cursed. One day, Jeff gave me a task I really didn't want to do. He handed me a couple of bags and told me to take them down to the basement. I had never been down there, and when I asked where it was, he pointed down the hall. "Last door on the left," he said. I started walking toward the door, but then he stopped me. "Don't go down there by yourself," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "There's a lot of junk down there. Don't trip over anything." I just nodded and kept walking. I didn't think anything of it at first, but when I reached the door, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. I looked at the dark staircase that led down into the basement. The light switch was to my left, but the bulb was flickering. I had no idea why nobody bothered to fix it. I hesitated for a moment, but then I heard a door open from the lobby. It wasn't Jeff yet, but I didn't want to wait, so I reached out and flipped the light switch. The light flickered on, casting weak shadows across the stairs. Then I heard it, a low, raspy voice from the bottom of the stairs. Hey, Semir." I froze, my heart pounding. A shadow from the bottom of the staircase started to stretch up toward me. I couldn't see who or what it was, but the voice sounded like it came from a person, though it was sickly distorted. "Hello." I called out, though I knew I was the only one on this side of the building. No one else should be down there. My pulse raced, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. "You gotta see this. Come here and look." The voice was getting louder, more insistent. The shadow kept moving up the stairs. It was coming closer. I panicked. Without thinking, I tossed the bags down the stairs, shut off the light, and bolted back to the lobby. Jeff had just come back inside. I told him about what happened, but he just shrugged it off. "Nothing here is going to hurt you," he said nonchalantly, like it was just another day in the life of the theater. I didn't feel great about it, but I went back to the basement with Trevor later to check it out. When we turned on the flickering light again, the bags I had thrown down the stairs were gone. It wasn't until later that morning, when I was sitting in the projection area, that I realized just how unsettling the theater really was. Around 6 a.m., we'd take a break. Jeff and Trevor usually went to McDonald's, but I didn't want to eat yet, so I stayed behind. I'd lie down in the hallway beneath the projector area and listen to my iPod. But no matter how loud I turned the music up, I couldn't drown out the heavy footsteps coming from upstairs. It sounded like someone was sprinting back and forth above me. Loud, heavy thumps, like a linebacker running through the hall. I told Jeff about it once, and he dismissed it, saying it was just the building settling or equipment causing noise. But it wasn't just the footsteps. There were voices, too. Sometimes from Theater 5, sometimes from the projector room, or just echoing through the halls. I tried to ignore it, but it always felt like I was being watched. The most terrifying encounter, though, happened when I was alone at the beginning of my shift. The projection area was dark, and I was supposed to go upstairs and turn on all the lights. I had to carry a flashlight with me, but I couldn't find it. It was later found in the garbage, another mess that Charlie had caused. I walked through the dark hallway, flipping switches, whistling the theme song from the Andy Griffith Show to myself, just to keep my nerves steady. But something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I stopped whistling, and my heart skipped a beat. In the darkness, I could make out a figure, tall, hunched over. At first, I thought it was a cardboard cutout, but then it moved. It was real. A person. A man. The figure stood up slowly, at least 7 feet tall, and started walking toward me. It was whistling, imitating my tune, and the sound sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, unable to speak or run. It took a few steps toward me, each one slower than the last. I could make out the silhouette against the faint red light from the exit sign. His body language was off. There was something about the way he moved that didn't sit right. He had a limp in his left leg, and it made his walk uneven, like something was wrong with him. Just as he got closer, something caught his attention, and he turned and walked into an office, disappearing from sight. That was it. I left my 2-week notice the next day. I didn't care that the job was easy or that it paid decent money. There was something about that theater, something about the tall man and Charlie, that was too much. I couldn't go back. I've never set foot in that place again. It was a cool Friday night, the kind where you can still feel the warmth of the sun lingering in the air, but the breeze carries a chill that tells you fall is starting to settle in. My girlfriend and I had spent most of the evening lounging around her apartment, talking about everything and nothing at all, just enjoying the quiet before we were going to head downtown to meet some other friends for a night out. We had a couple of friends over, Liam and Josh, and we were all just drinking a little, having a smoke, and catching up. Her apartment was on the first floor of a building that didn't see too much traffic, so it felt pretty secluded. She had a small studio, cozy and tight, and just off the side of her apartment was a private porch that wasn't accessible through the apartment itself. To get to it, you had to go out the front door and walk around a little corner, but it was close enough that it felt like an extension of the space. It was a perfect spot to hang out when you just wanted to chill, smoke a cigarette, and talk. I was leaning against the railing, looking out at the quiet street. Liam and Josh were chatting about something, and I could hear them laughing. I didn't really care about what they were saying, but their laughter was kind of nice, grounding, like a reminder that everything was okay. The night was still young. Out of nowhere, Liam asked, "Hey, who else is coming over tonight?" His voice was casual, but there was something about the way he asked that made me glance up and instinctively turn toward the window of the apartment. I didn't even realize it at first, but as I looked through the window, I saw a figure inside, The guy was standing at the kitchen counter, his body twisted in a weird way like he was trying to see the whole apartment, eyes darting around. His hair was a mess, kind of like a cracked-out meth head, all greasy and wild, and his clothes looked too big for him, hanging off his thin body. What stood out most was the way he was staring at the new set of cooking knives I'd just hung up for my girlfriend. I'd put them in a nice, visible spot to show them off. But this guy was inspecting them like he was making a mental note to come back and grab one later. Adrenaline surged through me before I could even think. Without saying a word, I pushed off the railing and dashed into the apartment. My mind was already racing, trying to figure out what to do. I burst through the door and straight into the studio. The guy didn't even notice me at first. He was too busy with the knives. I took a step forward, but the second I moved, he must have heard me because his head whipped around like he'd been caught. His eyes were wide with panic, and before I could even process what was happening, he darted toward the closet. He tried to hide, but it was too late. I rushed to the closet and yanked the door open. The moment I did, he screamed loud, primal, like a damn banshee. It took everything in me to not lose it in that moment, but I could tell right away that this guy wasn't all there. His eyes were wide, and his whole body was trembling. For a second, I just stood there, watching him. His hands were shaking like crazy, and I couldn't tell if he was going to come at me or just bolt. I didn't give him the chance to do either. I lunged at him, slamming him against the wall, pinning him with all the force I could muster. My hands were shaking too, but not from fear, more from the wild rush of adrenaline. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a flathead screwdriver lying on the floor beside him. The bastard had picked it up when I'd opened the door. It was a medium-sized one, and it looked sharp enough to do some serious damage. In that moment, I realized how lucky I was. I was seconds away from getting stabbed if I hadn't acted so quickly. I stayed on top of him, not letting him move, not letting him get up. I held him there, waiting for something. I don't even know what. Part of me wanted to hit him, really hit him, but something in my gut told me to just hold him down. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't tackled him when I did. If I'd given him a chance to make a move, who knows what might have happened. After what felt like forever, I heard a knock on the door. Liam and Josh had heard the commotion and came rushing in to see what was going on. They were both wide-eyed, and when they saw the guy, they froze. I managed to push the guy into a chair, and we called the cops. By the time they arrived, the guy was shaking uncontrollably, looking around the room like he didn't even know where he was. He didn't put up a fight when the cops took him away, but the whole situation left me unsettled. We got a statement, and the cops confirmed that he'd been wandering the area, breaking into apartments and stealing stuff. This wasn't his first time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more. I should have beaten him, but I didn't. Maybe that's for the best. But the feeling of adrenaline was still there, still making my hands tremble. We never found out exactly what he was looking for, but whatever it was, he wasn't going to find it that night. I'm just glad I was there, glad I reacted the way I did. A couple of months later, I decided to do something completely stupid. I wanted an adventure, so I drove up to Connecticut to explore an old asylum I'd heard about. The place was huge, decaying, covered in overgrowth. I'd read about it online, and the idea of sneaking around this abandoned building by myself sounded like something out of a movie. The place was eerie, and I was ready for a good time. I drove up in the early afternoon, but by the time I got there, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The cold of November was already creeping in, but I didn't mind. I didn't care. I was excited, in a way. The air smelled damp, and the ground was covered in leaves. The asylum loomed in front of me, its cracked windows and broken doors telling the story of how it had been abandoned. I had the place to myself, or at least I thought I did. The hallways were silent as I made my way deeper into the building. Each step felt careful, deliberate. The floors creaked under my weight, and I had to be quiet. I didn't want to disturb anything, didn't want to ruin the experience by making too much noise. The walls were covered in peeling paint and mold, and the windows were either boarded up or shattered. It was a strange mix of beauty and decay, and I was too curious to be scared. But then I heard it, a noise. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind or the house settling. But then I heard it again, footsteps. Running footsteps. I froze in place, trying to make sense of it. It was too quick to be anyone just walking through the hall. And then I heard the sound again, running, getting closer. It didn't sound like an adult, not at first. It sounded like children, but they weren't laughing. They weren't playing. They were running, frantic. My heart began to race. I turned around, calling out, "Hello." There was no answer. No one spoke back. The hallway was empty, but the running didn't stop. It got closer, the sound of footsteps moving behind me, but on the other side of the wall. I shouted again, this time offering a silly joke. "I'll trade wine for weed if anyone wants to talk." It didn't matter why I said it. I was just trying to break the tension. For a second, everything went silent. Complete silence. The kind of quiet that presses down on you, suffocating. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But then, as I walked through another room, I heard it again. The running. And this time, there was a laugh. It wasn't a child's laugh. It wasn't playful. It was deep, harsh, and it sent a chill down my spine. It sounded like a grown man, but it was so twisted, so wrong, that I couldn't make sense of it. I walked toward the noise, trying to find the source. But the hallway was empty, and as I walked closer to the sound, it faded away, leaving only silence again. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through a crack in the wall, I saw it, an eyeball. A human eyeball, staring directly at me. It blinked slowly, and my heart stopped. I couldn't breathe for a second. My entire body froze. I was trapped, stuck in that moment. My brain went into overdrive, plotting the quickest route out of the building, trying to map a way back to my car. And then that laugh again. It came from right behind me, too close. Without thinking, I turned and bolted. I didn't even care where I was going. I just ran. The sound of footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer, pushed me faster. I didn't stop until I was back outside, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs burning from the sprint. I got in my car and drove off, not looking back. I never told anyone what happened, not in detail, but I've never gone back to that place. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't just abandoned. It was something else. Something I didn't want to understand. I remember my grandmother always talking about the pub she and my granddad used to own. It wasn't just any pub, it came with a house attached. A house that had more than its fair share of odd happenings, or so she claimed. Every time she brought it up, she'd smile faintly, like she wasn't sure whether to laugh it off or not. But you could see the unease in her eyes whenever the topic came up. She'd tell us, her grandkids, these strange little stories that left us more than curious. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. Kids never really do they? But over the years, as the stories kept coming, I started to wonder if there was something more to them than just her fanciful memories. One night, she told me about an evening that had stuck in her mind ever since it happened, and it went like this. It was one of those quiet nights where the pub was just about empty. My granddad had locked up, and he was doing his usual rounds, checking everything before heading upstairs to bed. The house and the pub were connected, but they weren't part of any grand design. Just a small, cozy home with a couple of rooms and a kitchen that felt a little too old for its own good. That particular night, my grandmother and the kids went to bed early. I don't know why. Maybe they were tired. Maybe it was just one of those nights where everything felt like it could settle into a peaceful quiet. My granddad stayed behind, though, as usual, to finish up the bar duties. After closing time, he locked the doors and, like he always did, went straight to bed, leaving the kitchen quiet and still for the night. Or, at least, that's what he said. But my grandmother, lying in bed with her mind drifting off to sleep, heard something. It wasn't loud, more like clattering. You know, the sound of pots or something metal banging around. It came from the kitchen, just down the hall. She assumed it was my granddad. Maybe he was cleaning something, getting ready for the morning. He always had a way of keeping the place spotless, even after a long night. So, she didn't think much of it at first. She simply rolled over and tried to fall back asleep. But the noise didn't stop. It carried on for what seemed like ages. Clatter, clink, thud. Like someone was moving around in there, dropping things, then picking them up, maybe banging a pot around on the counter. Eventually, she got up. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she shuffled down the hall in her nightgown to see what was going on. But when she reached the kitchen, the place was completely still. Everything was exactly as it should be. No pots, no pans, nothing out of place. It was almost like the noise had never even happened. Confused, she went back to bed. But the next morning, the first thing she asked my granddad was, "What were you doing in the kitchen last night? Making all that noise?" He looked at her bewildered and said, "What noise?" She frowned. "I heard pots and pans clanging around. I thought you were cleaning up or something." But my granddad was certain. He hadn't gone anywhere near the kitchen. After closing up the pub, he'd locked up and gone straight to bed. There was no reason for him to be up in the kitchen in the middle of the night. That was the first of many odd things that my grandmother would later mention. But at the time, it didn't seem like anything more than a strange, isolated incident. Yet, over the years, it became clear that there was something about that place, the house, specifically, that unsettled people. I'm not sure when the next incident happened, but it came out of nowhere, one of those things that makes you stop and think for a moment longer than you should. My uncle, who was just a young child at the time, had been spending the night with my grandparents. He had always been a curious kid, one of those kids who asked questions about everything, trying to piece the world together in his own way. One evening, after dinner, my grandparents noticed that he seemed a little quieter than usual. When they asked him what was wrong, he hesitated before speaking, as though he wasn't sure how to explain it. "I saw someone," he said, his voice small. My grandmother, ever the practical woman, raised an eyebrow. "Saw someone? Where?" "At the top of the stairs," he said, his face serious. "A man, just standing there. I don't know who he was." My grandparents didn't know what to say. They checked the house, but of course, no one was there. They thought it was just an overactive imagination, the kind of thing that young kids come up with when they're scared or half asleep. But when my uncle kept bringing it up, each time more insistent, they began to wonder. It didn't help matters when other people started having strange experiences too. The pub had been sold several times over the years, but no one ever seemed to stay for long. The owners would come and go, leaving within a year or two, never sticking around long enough to make any real improvements. They always said the house felt off. Not just the pub itself, but the house that came with it. The house had a way of creeping up on you, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It wasn't anything that could be explained, but everyone who lived there felt it, this cold, lingering presence that didn't belong. Years later, my mother went back to visit the old place. It had been some time since anyone in our family had been there, and she was curious to see how much had changed. The bar was still there, but it had a new owner. My mom struck up a conversation with the woman running the place. The woman, who was relatively new to the pub, mentioned something that caught my mom off guard. "None of my staff will stay late anymore," she said. "They all claim to have seen or felt strange things, voices in the walls, footsteps when no one's around, that kind of thing. It's not just one or two of them either. It's everyone." My mom looked at her, trying to gauge whether she was serious or just messing with her. But the woman was serious. "I won't even live in the house," the woman added, looking a little uneasy. "I couldn't handle it. It creeps me out." My mom was taken aback. She'd heard the stories from my grandmother before, but hearing it from someone who didn't know the family, someone who was just a stranger, was different. It made everything feel more real. Maybe there was something to all those stories after all. But the thing that stuck with my mom the most wasn't the stories. It was the house itself. Even though it had been empty for some time, the air around it felt heavy, like it was holding something back. Maybe the house wasn't haunted in the way most people think of ghosts and spirits, but there was something unsettling about it. Something that made everyone who passed through it feel the need to leave quickly. I've never been one to jump to conclusions about things like this, but every time I hear one of those stories, whether it's from my grandmother, my mom, or someone else, it's hard not to think that there's more going on with that house than meets the eye. It's a place that makes people uncomfortable, and not just in the usual way. It's something deeper, something that can't be explained away by time, by creaky floorboards, or by people's imaginations. The house is just wrong. It doesn't need any ghost stories or supernatural explanations. It's something about the way the air smells, the way the walls seem to press in on you when you're alone, the way the silence feels like it's just a little too thick to breathe through. No one stays there for long, and even the new owners, despite all the renovations, all the new furniture, and all the changes they've made, still end up leaving. And I think I understand why now. It's not the ghost stories or the strange noises. It's the feeling you get when you're there, the feeling that you're never really alone. The night of that Christmas at my aunt's house is something I'll never forget. I was 8 years old, still young enough to be easily swept away by the chaos of a large family gathering. but old enough to understand when something didn't quite feel right. It was one of those Christmases when everyone in the family comes together, no matter how far we've all traveled. The entire house was buzzing, filled with the scent of traditional foods, the chatter of cousins running around, and the faint sound of mariachi music spilling through the halls. My aunt's house was always lively, especially during Christmas. The floors were creaky and the walls were thick, with old portraits of ancestors hanging on every available space. The kitchen was the heart of the house, alive with the sounds of clattering pots and the constant hum of laughter. There were people everywhere, aunts, uncles, cousins, the occasional neighbor. Every room was lit, from the kitchen to the back living room, each corner illuminated by warm yellow light. Around 1 in the morning, the mood shifted abruptly. The music and laughter were suddenly cut off by a harsh, unnatural silence. The lights flickered once, twice, and then nothing. Complete darkness. The sudden loss of light caught everyone off guard. At first, there was a collective pause. Everyone in the house waiting, not sure what had happened. A few moments of confusion passed before we started hearing the usual murmurs of discomfort from some of the younger kids, and a few adults cursing under their breath, trying to figure out how to handle it. My uncle, a tall man with graying hair, stood up from where he was sitting at the dining table and told everyone to stay put. He knew exactly where the fuse box was. It was down in the cellar, beneath the kitchen. I wasn't about to let him go alone, so I volunteered to go with him. The darkness felt heavier in a house like that, the kind of darkness that made you feel exposed, like something was watching you. The kitchen smelled like hot oil and spices, but the warmth from the lights was now replaced with an uncomfortable cold. My uncle made his way toward the back door, and I followed behind, careful not to trip over the loose tiles on the floor. We went through the kitchen, the door creaking loudly behind us as we stepped into the narrow hallway leading to the cellar door. The stairs creaked beneath our weight as we descended, the darkness swallowing us whole as the faint noise of the house faded behind us. The cellar was always a creepy place. The air was damp and smelled of earth, and the only source of light was a small window on the far side, but it was so dark outside that it didn't help. I could feel my breath getting heavier as the cold air seemed to sink into my bones. My uncle, who had been confident moments before, now seemed slightly uneasy. I placed my hand on his right shoulder for reassurance. The way we were stumbling through the dark made me feel even more exposed, as if we were walking blindfolded through a world we didn't belong in. We moved through the room slowly, my hand still resting on his shoulder, guiding myself with the motion of his steps. The cellar was divided into 2 sections. The main part, where there were a few old boxes stacked in the corner, and the other side, which led to the back of the house, where the fuse box was. My uncle was trying to move quickly, but the darkness made every step feel like a slow-motion film, stretching the seconds into what felt like minutes. Then it happened. I heard something, a rustling sound, low and skittering. At first, I thought it was just a rat or some other animal that had gotten into the cellar. But the noise was distinct, like something larger, something that moved with purpose. I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks on me in the dark, but I felt a strange shiver crawl up my spine. My uncle didn't seem to notice, or at least he didn't acknowledge it. We continued onward, but the sound seemed to follow us, getting closer. Another rustling. This time, it sounded like it was right behind us. My uncle didn't stop, but I could feel the tension in his movements. I reached out instinctively to touch his shoulder again, and as I did, I heard a slap. It wasn't a loud slap, but the sound was sharp in the silence of the cellar. My uncle's back jerked slightly. He stopped walking, his breath coming a little faster. "Did you just slap me?" he asked, his voice low but edged with confusion. I froze. I hadn't touched him in any way other than placing my hand on his shoulder. I looked at him, feeling my heart race. There was no explanation for what had just happened. We were the only ones down there. And yet, there was a definite slap noise, as if something had hit him. Something we couldn't see. "No," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to reassure him or myself. My uncle looked around in the thick darkness, but there was nothing there, just the cold, musty air and the silence that enveloped us. He rubbed his back, but seemed to dismiss it as just a weird sensation. He took another step forward, his hand finding the fuse box finally. The sound of his fingers twisting the knob to restore power was like a lifeline in the otherwise stillness. The lights flickered back on, and the house came back to life. The music in the living room resumed, and the bustle of people talking and laughing filled the air again. But despite the lights returning, there was something different now. My uncle was more quiet than usual, his expression distant. It was as though something had shifted inside him, though he didn't say anything at first. When we returned upstairs, no one seemed to notice that anything had happened. The party was in full swing again, the lights flickering above the living room and kitchen. My uncle joined the rest of the adults, who were continuing their conversations, but he didn't seem fully present. He looked distracted, as if he were trying to shake off something that was nagging at him. It wasn't until later that night, after most of the guests had gone home, that we noticed something odd. My uncle's wife, who had been busy cleaning the kitchen, noticed him rubbing his back again. She asked him what was going on, and he tried to brush it off, saying it was nothing. But then, she insisted that he lift up his shirt. I watched as he hesitantly pulled the fabric of his shirt up, revealing his back. There, across his left shoulder blade, was a large red handprint. The skin was raised, as though something had grabbed him forcefully. It wasn't a gentle mark. It looked like a bruise that had been formed in the shape of fingers, pressing down hard enough to leave a lasting imprint. I stared at the mark, my stomach sinking. I had been right behind him. There was no way I could have missed someone touching him. No way I could have missed any kind of noise or movement that would explain the slap. The handprint was real, no trick of the light, no illusion caused by the dark. And it wasn't the kind of mark that could just appear out of nowhere. Everyone in the room fell silent when they saw it. My aunt's face turned pale, and she crossed herself. My uncle's wife looked shaken, her eyes wide with concern. My aunt muttered something under her breath about la mano negra, a phrase that always sent chills down my spine when I heard it. It was something from the old stories, about a shadowy hand that could reach out and leave its mark on people. I wanted to laugh it off, to say it was just some weird coincidence. But deep down, I couldn't explain what had happened. There was no logical explanation for how a handprint had appeared on his back, or how we had heard the slap but hadn't seen anything. It made no sense. As the night wore on, I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. I couldn't help but feel that something had been there with us in the dark cellar, something that wasn't quite human. My uncle had never been one to entertain superstitions, but that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had touched him, something that shouldn't have. The rest of the Christmas celebration was a blur. I didn't say much after that, and neither did anyone else. My uncle didn't talk about it either, though I could see that the event was bothering him. And from that night forward, I couldn't look at the cellar door the same way again. It wasn't just a dark basement anymore. It was a place where something unseen, had touched my uncle, something that left its mark on him, and no one could explain it. In the years that followed, I would often think back to that night, trying to make sense of it. But the more I thought about it, the less I understood. I wanted to find a logical explanation, to convince myself that it was just some strange trick of the mind, a shadow, a sensation caused by our nerves in the dark. But deep down, I knew there was something about that night that was far more unsettling than I could ever put into words. Something had been there with us in that cellar, and it had left its mark. And it was something that to this day I can't explain. Back when I was in college, about 7 years ago, I was living the typical college life, stressed out, trying to keep up with classes, and juggling a few too many late-night study sessions. I wasn't the best at planning ahead, so when I got word that I had to move apartments last minute, I was completely unprepared. The reason? Well, I had been a lazy college student, procrastinating on finding a place to live for the summer. The apartment I was in had been great for the school year, but the lease ended, and I didn't think ahead to where I'd stay next. My parents were visiting for the weekend, and they offered to help me find something quick, which was probably a blessing in disguise. We were on a tight schedule, so we needed something cheap and close to campus. After some searching, we found a small basement apartment just across the street from the university. It wasn't the best place in the world, but it had the essentials. My parents were thrilled, and I was just relieved to get it over with. I wasn't too picky. I just needed a roof over my head for the next 3 months. The basement was split into 4 rooms. The first room, the living area, was the main space, and it had a small table and a comfy-looking couch. To the right was a kitchen, fairly basic with some old cabinets and a stove. Right next to the kitchen was the bathroom, small but functional. The bedroom was on the left side of the living room, but there was this weird little hallway or corridor that connected the bedroom to the living area. I didn't think much of it at first. It seemed like a decent enough space. The room itself was furnished, though a little outdated. A bed, a dresser, and some small nightstands. Nothing special, but it would work. Despite the place being fine, I immediately felt uneasy about the bedroom. There was just something off about it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it didn't feel right. I know it sounds strange, but I preferred to sleep on the couch in the living room, even though the bedroom had a perfectly fine bed. It was just a gut feeling. The weirdest part was that the feeling didn't really come from the space itself, but from the way it felt like the room was staring at me. It sounds ridiculous, but the bedroom was situated in such a way that it was impossible not to feel like something, or someone, was watching me when I sat in the living room. The first few nights were the worst. I would sit on the couch, watching TV or playing video games, and I'd constantly feel like someone was standing behind me, just out of view. It was such a specific sensation. It wasn't like hearing footsteps or a creak in the floorboards. It was the feeling of being observed, of someone just staring at me from the bedroom door. Sometimes I'd turn around quickly, expecting to see someone standing there, but of course, no one was ever there. I'd even try to shake it off, but it was hard to focus on anything when I felt like someone was in the room with me. The feeling stuck with me all the time, whether I was alone or not. For a while, I couldn't even pinpoint why it felt so off. The apartment wasn't haunted, I told myself. It didn't have that classic creepy vibe you read about in ghost stories. But it wasn't just me who felt it. I had friends come over once or twice, and they noticed it too. No one could explain why, but it was like the apartment had this uncomfortable atmosphere about it. I started to keep the bedroom door shut all the time, hoping it would help. But it didn't. The feeling never went away. Even when I went to bed, I would find myself lying awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the overwhelming sense of unease that crept over me. It felt like I was never truly alone in that place, even though there were no sounds, no sights, just that suffocating sensation of being watched. Sometimes, I'd stay over at a friend's place to get away from the apartment for a while, but when I came back, that feeling would always greet me like an old acquaintance. I could never shake it. I spoke to a couple of my friends about it once, trying to explain the weird feeling. Of course, they all laughed. "Dude, you're just being paranoid. There's nothing in there," they said. And yeah, I wasn't exactly the type of guy to get spooked easily. So, I brushed it off, thinking it was just me being a bit too stressed with school. As the summer went on, I grew used to it, or at least I convinced myself I had. When the semester finally ended, I was glad to be done with the whole thing. I packed up my stuff and left that basement behind, thinking I'd never have to deal with it again. The strange feeling faded into the background as I went on with my life. I graduated, moved to a new city, and got a job. Life moved on. But about 2 years ago, something happened that brought it all rushing back. One of my college friends, who I hadn't spoken to in a while, texted me one evening. His message was simple. "Hey, is XXXX the door number you lived at in that creepy basement back in uni?" At first, I was confused. I didn't recognize the address he was talking about. "Yeah, why?" I responded. He replied almost immediately, sending me a picture of an old local newspaper. It was the obituary section from 2009. I couldn't understand why he was sending me this, but as I looked closer, I saw a picture of a young woman. She looked like she was about my age, maybe a little younger, with a pretty smile and a college ID photo. The obituary read, "Young student found deceased in her off-campus apartment." Next to her picture was the picture of a door. I recognized that door immediately. It was the same one I had walked past 100 times. It had a small number, XXXX, on the front, the same one that had been on the apartment I'd lived in. My stomach dropped as I read further. Cause of death, suicide by hanging. The deceased was a university student who had been living alone in the basement apartment. I sat there, frozen, staring at the screen. The room seemed to close in around me. It all started to make sense. The feelings of being watched, the strange sense of unease that never quite went away. I thought back to my time in that apartment, to all those nights I spent feeling like someone was in the room with me, but never actually seeing anything. I had always chalked it up to my own nerves, but now it felt like everything I had experienced there suddenly had a darker, more terrifying meaning. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I wasn't just being paranoid. Maybe there had been something there after all. But the worst part was realizing that I had unknowingly lived in that same place where a young woman had taken her life. The realization hit me hard, and for days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I thought about the hallway, the weird connection between the living room and the bedroom, the way that room always felt so wrong. I tried to put it out of my mind. It had been years since I lived there, and there was no point in dwelling on something like that. But deep down, I couldn't escape the thought of how much I had missed back then. The signs I ignored, the feelings I dismissed. Maybe if I had paid more attention, I would have known sooner. Maybe I would have been able to do something, anything, to stop the cycle of unease that seemed to have permeated that place. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it. Life went on. But every now and then, when I walk past an old, familiar door or step into a basement apartment that feels a little too cold, I can't help but wonder, what really happened in that place? And why did I always feel so watched? We were young, cocky, and looking for something thrilling to do. Back in high school and early college, a few of my friends and I would spend our weekends exploring the weird, the abandoned, and the downright creepy spots across New Jersey. We weren't really the ghost hunting type, but more the let's see what's out there kind. There are tons of books and websites dedicated to the strange and unexplained corners of NJ, from haunted places to sites that had a history of something sinister, or simply eerie locations that felt wrong in some way. A lot of it was harmless, some forgotten buildings, old mills, and a few places with unsettling stories. But this night, this one place was different. The abandoned oil refinery was the one we had been talking about for weeks. I don't know exactly why it drew us in, but there was something about it. Maybe it was because it was so isolated, or maybe it was the fact that it had been sitting there untouched for decades. The place was right off a back road, surrounded by thick woods, and I had heard rumors that it was near impossible to get to without getting lost. My friend Mark, the one with the blazer, had heard about it from a friend of his. That friend swore up and down that it was the creepiest spot in all of Jersey, but we didn't care. We were all about the thrill of it. It had been a rainy day, heavy rain, with flash floods and everything. The roads were slick, and the sky was still heavy with clouds. By the time we reached the refinery, it was well after midnight, probably closer to 1 a.m. We were all feeling that buzz, the kind of excited energy that comes with doing something a little stupid. We pulled up to the rusty, decaying gate of the refinery. The road had been bad enough already, full of puddles and runoff from the earlier rains. But the sight of the place gave it a whole new layer of foreboding. We parked near the gate and waited. Mark and I made eye contact through the windows, both of us giving the other a little nod. We had been to places like this before, abandoned factories, old train stations, and empty warehouses, but this was different. This place felt heavy. Maybe it was the silence or the way the trees seemed to close in on the area, but it just didn't feel right. We decided to head in. Mark, with his blazer, was ahead of me, so we started to follow him in. I was driving my small sedan, nothing special, not built for anything tough. The headlights of the blazer cut through the darkness, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. We got closer to the building, and that's when I saw it, this massive puddle, more like a small lake, stretching across the entire road. The water was dark, reflecting the pale light from the headlights, and I could see just how deep it was. Mark drove through first, slowly at first, then gunned it as he reached the middle. The water rose higher and higher on the blazer's wheels, completely covering them. I knew I wasn't going to make it through in my sedan. No way. My friends in the passenger seat were already laughing, calling me a pussy, and telling me to go for it. I hesitated for a moment, but then I thought, screw it, I'll give it a shot. So I backed up a bit, built up some speed, and slammed the gas pedal to the floor. I barely made it through the water, the engine sputtering a bit as it fought against the depth. But we got through. I felt a strange mixture of relief and stupidity. My heart was racing, and we all laughed, probably a little too loud, the adrenaline making everything seem hilarious. We parked just in front of the building, both of us facing the way we had just come. We stepped out of the cars, the cool night air biting into our skin, and started to wander around. There wasn't much to see in the immediate area, just old, rusted structures, the remnants of what looked like storage tanks, and a lot of broken glass and debris. We didn't go too far from the cars, mostly just peeking around and snapping some pictures with our phones. The place had this eerie stillness to it, a quiet that felt oppressive, almost as if the whole refinery had been abandoned for a reason. But still we pressed on. This was the kind of thing we came for. About an hour passed, maybe more. We had all had our fill of wandering and taking photos, so we decided it was time to leave. The whole place had an unsettling vibe, and the rain from earlier had left a damp, cold feeling in the air. We got back into the cars, turned the engines over, and started to head back out the way we came in. I remember feeling the tension fade, just a little, as we made our way toward the exit, the lights from the refinery fading behind us. But then we hit something weird. Both of our cars, which had been parked facing the building when we arrived, were now facing the opposite direction. We stopped immediately, confused. I checked my rearview mirror, thinking maybe I had accidentally turned my car around. But no, I had parked the same way I always do. Mark and his Blazer were facing the other way too. There was no way we had driven around and turned our cars by accident. It just didn't make sense. The road was narrow, and there was no way we could have turned around without realizing it. Not to mention, neither of us had gotten out of our cars after parking. It didn't take long for the others to realize what was happening, and a weird, uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Everyone was looking at each other, then at the cars. It was like that moment when you realize something isn't quite right, but you can't figure out what's causing it. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying something like, "Maybe someone's messing with us." But we all knew that didn't explain it. I checked my pockets. My keys were still there. There were no spare keys, nothing else to suggest that someone had moved the cars. We all got out to inspect, and that's when I noticed the puddle. The water, the massive puddle that had been blocking our path earlier, was gone. There was no trace of it. The ground was dry, even though just an hour ago it had been completely flooded. It was like the water had just vanished. It didn't make any sense. The air was colder now, and there was a strange stillness. We stood around for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. There was no logical explanation for it. None of us could figure out how the cars had turned around, or why the puddle had disappeared, or why everything felt different. At that point, I started to feel like we were being watched, like something was paying attention to us from the shadows of the refinery. I don't know what it was, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Mark suggested we get the hell out of there, and I didn't argue. We got back into our cars, started the engines, and slowly pulled away, the eerie feeling lingering in the air. We didn't say much on the way home. There was just a quiet, unsettling energy between all of us, and no one was really eager to break the silence. When we finally pulled into the parking lot of our friend's house, we all just sat there for a moment, the weight of what had happened still hanging in the air. We didn't know what to make of it, but we all agreed on one thing. It wasn't just some weird coincidence. To this day, we still tell the story, and each time, it feels like it happened just yesterday. None of us have been back to that refinery. The memory of the cars turned around, the puddle gone, the weird, inexplicable feeling, it stuck with us. We'll never know what really happened that night, but the one thing I'm sure of is that something wasn't right out there. Something moved the cars. Something made that water disappear. And for whatever reason, we were all lucky enough to get out of there without ever truly knowing what was watching us. I lived in a small, one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city. It was nothing fancy, just a simple space with a modest living room, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom connected to a walk-in closet. The kind of apartment that didn't have much character, but it was mine. I liked the quiet. I liked that I could come home from work, cook something quick, and just relax. At the time, I was living with my then boyfriend, a guy who was comfortable and familiar, though I never really felt at peace in that apartment. The first night I experienced something unsettling in that apartment wasn't anything special at first. It was just another night like any other. We were both in bed, curled up under the covers, each doing our own thing before sleep took over. He had fallen asleep quickly, as usual, but I tossed and turned, trying to find a comfortable position. The bed was small, and I didn't like that there was always this little creak in the floor beneath it, a noise that seemed to come from nowhere, especially in the quiet moments when everything else was still. I had almost drifted off when it happened, a loud noise. The kind of sound that cuts through the silence and makes your body snap to full attention, like something had just fallen, something heavy. I heard it coming from the walk-in closet, and instantly, my body was flooded with a cold sweat. My heart started pounding, and every muscle in my body tensed, but I didn't move. I didn't dare. The blankets were wrapped tightly around me, my chest rising and falling with every anxious breath. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want to move because, in some twisted part of my mind, if I stayed perfectly still, whatever it was would go away. The noise didn't happen again, but I stayed awake, listening, waiting for something else to happen. My eyes were pressed shut, and the longer I laid there, the more convinced I became that I was just imagining things. But I couldn't shake the fear in my chest. The thought that there was something in that closet, something that shouldn't be there, kept creeping into my mind. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually I fell back asleep, exhaustion finally overcoming the dread that had gripped me. The next morning, when I woke up, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I told myself it had to have been nothing, just a noise from the apartment settling, or maybe the wind moving something in the closet. But when I got up to start my day, something caught my eye. One of the bags I had placed on a shelf in the closet had fallen to the floor. I froze for a moment, staring at it. I wasn't sure if it had been like that before, but I thought maybe it had just been knocked off during the night. I felt a small sense of relief, convincing myself that there was a simple, logical explanation for everything. I went about my day, getting ready for work, and tried to put the whole thing behind me. It wasn't until my ex mentioned something that sent a chill down my spine. We were having breakfast when he casually said, "I had a bad dream last night." I nodded, not thinking much of it. "About what?" I asked, assuming it was just some random nightmare. He hesitated before answering, his voice a little unsure. "About the closet." I looked up at him, confused. "What about the closet?" He glanced at me, looking almost uncomfortable. "I saw you, walking backwards in the closet." I froze. I had never told him about the noise, the feeling, any of it. I had never mentioned the strange sense of dread I had felt in that closet. Yet here he was, telling me that he had dreamed of me in the closet, walking backwards. The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. It didn't make sense. I didn't sleepwalk. I didn't move in my sleep. And even if I had, I certainly wouldn't have walked backwards into a closet. That feeling of unease lingered in the apartment, but time passed, and eventually I moved on from it. I put the incident behind me, chalking it up to a strange coincidence, and went on with my life. But that wasn't the end of it. A couple of years later, I found myself in the same apartment complex, but this time in a different unit. I had moved in with my current boyfriend. We had only been living together for a few months, and everything seemed to be going fine. The apartment was nearly identical to the last one, but for some reason, it felt different. Maybe it was just the familiarity of the place, or maybe it was because I had experienced something odd there before. Either way, it should have been just like any other apartment, quiet, simple, and nothing too out of the ordinary. One night, I woke up to a soft sound. It was quiet at first, almost like a rustle in the room, but I couldn't place it. It didn't seem alarming, so I brushed it off and tried to go back to sleep. That's when my boyfriend stirred beside me. His voice was barely audible in the dark, but I could hear the concern in it. "So, I woke up and saw you standing in the closet last night," he said casually, almost as if it was an afterthought. I blinked, confused. "What?" "Yeah," he continued. "I woke up, and you were just standing there, staring at the closet. It was weird. I felt a coldness sweep over me. I couldn't understand what he was saying. "I don't sleepwalk," I replied, almost defensively. I hadn't told him about the previous incident in the old apartment, not wanting to sound paranoid or weird, but now it felt impossible to ignore. He shrugged, seemingly unconcerned. "I don't know. It was strange. I thought you were just sleepwalking, but I didn't know what to do." I sat up in bed, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the thought of it, the idea that I had been standing there, staring into that closet. The closet. It all felt too familiar, too wrong. I didn't want to believe it, but the memory of the first time, the noise, the feeling of dread, rushed back to me in full force. It was as if everything I had tried to ignore, everything I had tried to forget, was coming back to haunt me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that maybe I had been dreaming or that I was just confused. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how strange it all was. The apartment, the closet, the dreams, and now this. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The thought that something was wrong with that closet, that maybe it wasn't just a simple closet at all, gnawed at me. But I didn't have any answers. I didn't know what was happening, why it was happening, or if it would happen again. As the days passed, I began to feel more and more unsettled. I couldn't ignore the fact that both my ex-boyfriend and my current boyfriend had mentioned the closet. I couldn't shake the image of myself standing in that closet, facing the dark. What was happening to me? Why was I having these strange experiences in that place? And why hadn't I noticed the pattern sooner? I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, but they lingered, creeping into my consciousness when I least expected it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that closet, that apartment. But of course, I didn't tell my boyfriend what I was really thinking. I didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't want to give in to the fear that was slowly creeping up on me. I just wanted to live my life without the weight of these thoughts dragging me down. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was wrong with that closet. Something was wrong with me. And it was only a matter of time before I had to face whatever it was that was lurking in the shadows of that apartment. It was my freshman year of college, and I had just moved across the country from the West Coast to attend a small university in the Midwest. It was a huge change for me, being so far from home, but one thing made it bearable: my aunt. She lived in the same town, and I had always been close to her, so whenever I felt homesick or needed a break, I would go to her house. Her place was something out of a movie, this massive mansion perched on a hill, surrounded by thick woods. The closest neighbor was a half-mile away, which meant the house felt as isolated as it looked. The first time I visited after moving to college, I remember how eerie the silence was. There was no traffic noise, no bustling sounds of other homes, just quiet, with the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It was peaceful in a way, but the kind of peace that could make your thoughts louder, more intense. I remember feeling that discomfort in my stomach the first time I stayed overnight. Still, I always felt safe at my aunt's place. After all, she was family, and her house was like a fortress, with big gates and an elaborate security system that always made me feel protected. One evening, about a month into the semester, I found myself at her house alone. My aunt and uncle had gone out for the evening, and my cousins were off doing their own thing. I didn't mind. My aunt's house was a great place to unwind. I had the entire mansion to myself, so I decided to spend the night watching one of my favorite shows on the couch, Cold Case Files. I was always fascinated by crime documentaries, especially the ones on investigation discovery. Something about the cold, hard facts mixed with real-life suspense always drew me in. As I sat in the living room, the soft hum of the TV was the only sound in the house, and it felt comforting. It was around 9 p.m. when everything changed. I was deep into an episode when I heard it. A loud bang. No, not a knock, but a thud that rattled through the house, the kind of noise that makes your heart stop. It wasn't just a tap or a polite knock on the door. It was a violent, aggressive banging, loud enough to make me freeze. At first, I thought maybe it was a branch hitting the door from the wind. But then it came again. Bang, 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 as if someone was pounding on the door with their fists, demanding to be let in. I felt the blood drain from my face. My pulse started racing, and my mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. There was no one here except me, and no one should have been coming to the house at this time of night. I was alone, and everything that I had ever seen on those crime documentaries flashed through my mind. What if someone was trying to break in? What if someone knew I was alone and was coming for me? I quickly stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. The adrenaline kicked in, making my heart thump so loudly in my chest that I couldn't hear anything else. My first instinct was to run. I bolted from the living room and into the hallway, my feet making muffled thuds on the hardwood floor. I ran straight into the master bedroom, where I knew my aunt kept a walk-in closet attached to the bathroom. I've never been one to panic, but in that moment, I couldn't think straight. My hands were shaking as I fumbled through the drawers in the closet, pulling out a gun from one of the drawers. My aunt's family was huge into hunting, and she had kept a gun for protection. My fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy metal, and I held it in my hands, not sure what I was supposed to do with it, but feeling comforted by the weight. It was a gun, after all, something that could keep me safe, right? I positioned myself against the wall, trying to stay hidden, but in a way that would let me see the bathroom mirror. If anyone was going to come in, I needed to see them first. I didn't know what was happening, but I was certain that someone was out there. The fear surged again, and I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. What if they knew I was alone? What if they were watching me? I kept replaying the sound of that pounding on the door in my mind. It had been so loud, so aggressive. It didn't make any sense. Who would be out there, at this time of night, knocking like that? I grabbed my phone and dialed my aunt's number. No answer. I called my uncle. No answer. Panic began to set in as I realized that I had no one to turn to. I called my cousins. No answer there either. What was going on? Why was no one answering? I felt trapped. The house was huge, but it was also isolated. There were no other homes for miles. No one would hear me if I screamed. My mind was spiraling. What if someone was already inside? What if they were creeping around, waiting for the right moment? I couldn't stop thinking that I was about to become another victim in one of those crime shows I watched. 5 minutes passed. It felt like an eternity. My hands were trembling around the gun, and I tried to steady my breathing. I couldn't keep this up much longer. I dialed my cousin again. This time, he picked up. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the panic creeping through. "Hey, what's up?" he asked, sounding confused. "You okay?" "No," I nearly screamed. "Someone's banging on the door. I'm scared. I don't know what to do." "Wait, what? Are you serious?" "Yes. There's no one else here, and someone is knocking like they're trying to break in." He was silent for a moment. "I'll send one of my friends over. Don't worry. Just stay inside and stay calm." I didn't know what else to do, so I sat there waiting. Every little sound, the creak of the house settling, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, made my heart race. My mind kept flashing back to the pounding on the door. It had been so loud, so forceful. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, I heard the sound of someone walking up to the door. I jumped, my body tensing. The door handle rattled as it was turned. Someone was trying to open it. My breath caught in my throat. Was it him? Was the man on the other side of the door about to come in? But then I heard a voice. "Hey, is anyone home?" Relief flooded through me as I recognized the voice of my cousin's friend. I opened the door slowly, gun still in hand, my mind racing with questions. The guy stepped inside, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Hey, it's just me," he said, looking confused. "I think I figured out what's going on." "What? What's happening?" I demanded, not sure whether to feel relieved or still on edge. He looked at me, his eyes wide. So apparently, a FedEx package was delivered here, and it was supposed to be left at the door. The driver knocked, but he must have been a little too enthusiastic. "That's probably what you heard." I blinked, processing what he was saying. A package. That was what had caused all this. "I'm sorry," he continued. "I know this is weird, but I came to check on you, just in case. Everything seems fine." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was both a relief and completely embarrassing. I had been convinced I was about to be murdered, and it turned out to be a late-night delivery. As I sat back down on the couch, my heart rate slowly returned to normal. I thought about the whole situation, trying to understand how I had gone from calm to panicked in such a short amount of time. The banging, the fear, the thoughts of being trapped in this huge house alone. Everything had felt so real. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like just another bizarre moment in the long list of strange things that happened when you were alone in a mansion on top of a hill, surrounded by woods with no one else for miles. I was about 10 years old when my cat, Sabbath, passed away. He'd been with me since I was a little kid, and he was my best friend. I can't even remember a time when he wasn't a part of my life. He was this big, fat, sleek black cat with green eyes, and despite his size, he was gentle as could be. He never scratched or bit me, even when I would pester him, as only a kid can. I used to chase him around the house, tug on his tail, or drag him into my bed when I was supposed to be asleep. But he always just tolerated it, purring and rubbing his head against me like I was the most important thing in the world. We had this bond, this quiet understanding, that I never fully appreciated until he was gone. Sabbath was about 12 when he started getting sick. At first, we thought it was just getting old, the usual slowing down that comes with age. But then we realized something was wrong. He was losing weight fast, drinking water constantly, and peeing everywhere. My mom took him to the vet, and that's when we found out he had diabetes. The vet said it wasn't something that could be cured, and even with medication, it was going to be expensive. My mom didn't have the money for the meds, and we couldn't afford to keep him alive under those conditions. I was devastated, but I could see the sadness in her eyes too. She didn't want to make the decision, but we both knew what had to be done. I remember crying, not understanding the finality of it. I didn't want to say goodbye, but I didn't know how to say goodbye to something that had been there for almost as long as I could remember. The day my mom took him to be put down, I stayed in my room, too afraid to even go near him. It was like I couldn't face it. I don't know if it was because I was scared of how final it would be, or if I was afraid of seeing him in pain, but I just hid in my room. I regret not saying goodbye. I regret not spending those last few moments with him. But in the end, I knew that he wouldn't have wanted me to be sad. Sabbath always seemed like the kind of cat who would rather see you happy than dwelling on something sad. So I stayed in my room, crying quietly, and when my mom came back, she didn't say much. She just gave me a sad look and sat with me for a while, holding my hand as we both grieved in silence. Weeks passed after Sabbath died. It wasn't like I didn't try to move on, but it was impossible to forget him. The house felt emptier without him. I could still hear the faint sound of his paws on the floor at night, or sometimes I'd think I saw him out of the corner of my eye, curled up on my bed or rubbing up against the leg of the couch. But every time I turned to look, it was just the emptiness of my room staring back at me. I tried to bury the sadness. I tried to play video games, watch TV, and hang out with friends, but nothing could fill that hole that Sabbath had left. One evening, I was lying on my bed, just zoning out. I had one of those cheap laser pointer toys on my computer desk. It was one of those little things that were kind of fun to play with, especially if you had a pet to entertain. I hadn't really used it much since Sabbath passed. It sat there on the desk, forgotten for the most part. It was late afternoon or early evening, somewhere around there. The kind of time where the sun is still up, but you can feel the darkness of night creeping in. I wasn't tired or anything, just laying there, lost in my thoughts. I wasn't really doing anything, just lying there and staring at the ceiling. The air was cool, and I could hear the faint sounds of traffic in the distance and the occasional car passing by. Nothing out of the ordinary. And then, out of nowhere, I saw the laser pointer light up. It was faint at first, just a small red dot on the wall. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I'd accidentally bumped the desk, or maybe there was something wrong with the button. But it flickered again, like it was glitching. Now, this is where things started getting weird. It wasn't like the light was flickering from me bumping the desk. It was more like the light was turning on and off by itself. I couldn't make sense of it. I didn't have anyone else in my room, and I wasn't near the desk. The button on the laser pointer was just sitting there, untouched. I sat up on my bed, watching the laser pointer. It flickered again, the same pattern as before. The light would come on, flicker out, then come on again. It didn't make any sense. I wasn't scared at first, just confused. Maybe it was some kind of malfunction. I leaned forward, staring at the flickering red dot. I started thinking about Sabbath. I guess I was still a little hung up on him, not really able to let go. And as I stared at that flickering light, a thought crossed my mind. What if it was him? What if he was somehow trying to get my attention? Now, I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that. I was an atheist, a skeptic. I didn't believe in the supernatural. But in that moment, something about the situation just felt different. I leaned forward even more, my heart racing for no real reason. I don't know why I did it, but I started talking to the laser pointer. I wasn't really expecting anything to happen, but I couldn't help myself. "Are you trying to talk to me?" I asked out loud, my voice trembling slightly. "Is this you, Sabbath?" The laser blinked once. My stomach flipped. I couldn't believe it. It didn't make any sense. How could it blink like that? But there it was, the little red dot flicking on and off, just like before. "Are you really gone?" I asked next. "Can you hear me?" It blinked once again. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way this could be real, but at the same time, it felt like it was. It felt like Sabbath was there with me somehow. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the laser pointer, trying to make sense of what was happening. Finally, after a few moments, I asked, "Are you okay? Are you in peace?" The laser blinked once more. By now, I was starting to cry, my face flushed with the weight of everything I had been feeling. I couldn't stop the tears from flowing. I felt like something inside me was breaking open, like the grief I'd been holding in for so long was finally finding a way out. "I'm sorry I didn't say goodbye," I whispered, feeling a knot in my throat. "I'm so sorry." The light blinked twice. For a while, the laser pointer continued to flicker on and off, as if it were answering my questions. I asked a few more things, but it was hard to keep track of what I was saying or what the light was doing. All I could focus on was the overwhelming sense of comfort I felt, as if Sabbath was there with me, reassuring me, telling me that everything was okay. that he didn't blame me for anything, that I wasn't at fault. Eventually, the blinking stopped. The laser pointer went dark. I stayed sitting on the bed, my hands shaking as I processed everything that had just happened. I felt like I had just had a conversation with my cat, even though I knew that was impossible. I finally gathered the courage to stand up and check the laser pointer. When I picked it up, I saw that the batteries were completely dead. I was stunned. How could it have been flickering like that if the batteries were dead? I didn't have any answers. I still don't. But that night, something in me shifted. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't try to. I just accepted it for what it was. Maybe it wasn't my cat. Maybe it was just some weird coincidence, some freak malfunction. But in my heart, I knew what I felt. I knew what had happened. Sabbath came to visit me, to check on me, and to tell me that it was okay to let go. That night was the last time I ever felt his presence, and honestly, it was the last time anything like that ever happened. After that, I never experienced anything paranormal again. Nothing that I couldn't explain. Nothing that left me wondering. But to this day, whenever I think about that moment, I can't shake the feeling that Sabbath was trying to tell me something. Maybe it was just my grief, my mind playing tricks on me. But I don't think so. I think it was him, in whatever form, just making sure I knew that he was still with me, even if he wasn't physically there anymore. And I've never stopped missing him. I remember the night so vividly. It feels like it happened just yesterday. It was a couple of years ago when my family decided to take a vacation to Slovenia. We were staying in a small hostel in Bled, nestled in the heart of this charming town. The place had a certain old-world feel to it, with narrow cobblestone streets, old stone buildings, and of course, the picturesque lake that glistened under the sun. The entire town had this quiet, almost eerie vibe to it, something out of a fairy tale but with a dark undertone. The first day was filled with excitement. We explored the town, wandered along the lake, and even visited Bled Castle perched high on a cliff above the water. The castle looked like something straight out of a medieval storybook, with its towering stone walls and ancient architecture. It was beautiful, but as we made our way through the old corridors, there was something unsettling about it. The air felt heavy, like the place was holding secrets, whispering stories of the past. That night, we stayed at a small hostel. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was comfortable enough. We were all tired from the day's adventures and settled into one large room. My sisters and I shared the space, with one of my sisters sleeping on the couch near the foot of my bed. The room had a faint smell of wood, likely from the old floorboards that creaked with every movement, and the faint glow of moonlight filtered in through the curtains. The room was dim, but just enough light shone through for me to make out shapes. The peacefulness of the night was almost too perfect, but something inside me kept me awake. I don't know what time it was, but I remember it being around midnight. I had just started to drift off when I heard it, the creaking of the wooden floor. It was subtle at first, but it was there. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the old house settling. But then the sound came again, this time closer. It was slow and deliberate, like someone was moving quietly through the room. My heart started to race, and I held my breath, straining to hear more. The floorboards creaked again, only this time it was followed by the sound of soft footsteps, careful but unmistakable. I felt a chill run down my spine as I lay frozen in my bed, staring at the dark shadows cast by the moonlight. My sister on the couch was still asleep, her breathing steady and unaware of what was happening. I couldn't see who it was. All I could make out was a large silhouette moving slowly across the room. Whoever it was, they were coming closer, getting nearer to the couch where my sister was sleeping. I felt my chest tighten, panic surging through my body. I tried to scream, to shout out, to do anything, but my voice wouldn't come. It was like I was paralyzed, unable to move or make a sound. My hands were clammy with sweat, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the person sneaking in would hear it. The figure moved with purpose, and I could see him now, just barely, in the pale moonlight. He was tall, much taller than anyone in our group, and his body was broad, like he was built for strength. I could make out the outline of his face, though it was distorted in the dim light. He had dark hair and a rough, unshaven look, and I could see his eyes glinting in the shadows. I could feel him staring at me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He hadn't noticed I was awake, or so I thought. His slow movements made it seem like he was trying to be stealthy, but I could see every step he took, Every inch he crept closer to my sister. He was about to reach her. I felt like time had stopped. My mind was screaming for me to do something, anything, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the bed, paralyzed by fear. All I could do was watch. I could hear his breath now, steady but heavy, as if he was trying to remain quiet. My sister, blissfully unaware, slept through it all, the sound of her steady breathing contrasting with the tension building in the room. Then, the figure reached my sister's couch. He knelt down slowly, his body looming over her, and for a moment, I thought he was going to touch her, maybe worse. I could see his hand moving toward her. That was when my fear hit its peak, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my body. I was convinced something horrible was about to happen, but I was still too terrified to move, too terrified to even blink. My eyes were locked on his every movement, and I couldn't tear myself away. My body felt numb, as if my fear had taken over every sense I had. But then, as if sensing something, the figure suddenly stopped. I saw him freeze, and for a moment, everything went completely still. His head slowly turned toward me. His eyes locked with mine, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything to make him stop, but my body still refused to move. I couldn't tear my gaze away from him. For what felt like an eternity, he stared at me, his eyes cold and calculating. And then, without a word, without a sound, he slowly stood up, his movements deliberate but swift now. He didn't make a sound as he retreated from the room, his figure blending into the darkness of the hallway. It took me what felt like hours to finally move. As soon as I could, I jumped out of bed and rushed to my sister. I shook her awake, my hands trembling. She stirred but didn't fully wake up. I wanted to tell her everything, but I couldn't find the words. I was terrified that if I said something, I would wake up in the morning and realize it had all been a bad dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew what I had seen. The next morning, I told my family everything. I was shaking as I explained what had happened, but they all dismissed it as a bad dream or my imagination running wild. No one believed me. My sisters thought I was being dramatic, and my parents said I was probably just overthinking things. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them that it was real, that something was wrong, but there was no way to convince them. The night had passed, and it felt like no one cared about what I had gone through. Later that day, we visited another landmark, Bled Castle. It was this medieval-looking structure perched high on a hill, overlooking the town below. The castle had this gothic vibe to it, the kind you see in horror movies. The tall, dark towers seemed to loom over the town like they were watching, guarding the secrets of the past. As we toured the castle, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The whole town had this eerie atmosphere to it, as if the past was alive in the present, quietly lurking in the shadows. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Every creak of the floor, every shift in the air made me jump. I kept thinking about the figure that had sneaked into our room. What did he want? Why was he there? Was he just some random person, or was there something more to it? I couldn't stop replaying the night in my mind, and it was making it impossible for me to rest. The whole experience had shaken me to my core. The following days in Slovenia were a blur. I tried to push the fear aside, but it stayed with me, lurking just beneath the surface. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in that room. I started looking over my shoulder everywhere I went, wondering if the man would appear again. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight. Even in the daylight, when everything seemed calm, I felt a constant sense of unease. By the time we left Bled, I hadn't slept properly in days. I was exhausted, physically and mentally. The whole experience had left me shaken, and I couldn't fully shake the fear that something was wrong. I couldn't help but wonder if the man had been watching us for longer than I realized. Had he been following us from the castle? Was he waiting for the right moment to strike? When we got home, I tried to put it out of my mind, but the memories lingered. I would still wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, heart racing, convinced that someone was in the room with me. And even now, whenever I think back to that night in Bled, I can't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something dark and twisted that I'll never fully understand. To this day, I can't explain it. Was it a random intruder? Or was it something more sinister? I'll never know for sure, but I'll never forget the fear I felt that night. The fear of being watched, of knowing that someone was there, inches away from my sister, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. I can only hope that whatever it was, whatever that man wanted, never comes back. I was 10 years old, and it was one of those summer nights that felt like it would never end. The air was thick and warm, carrying the distant sounds of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog from the neighbor's yard. It was the kind of night that felt like a normal sleepover would be just that. A simple, fun evening filled with whispered stories, giggles, and a bit of childhood fear over things like shadows in the dark. I was at my friend Amy's house, which was just a few blocks away from mine. It was a small house, older, with creaky floors and rooms that always seemed a little too quiet during the night. The kind of house where the silence made you wonder what was lurking in the corners or behind the doors. Amy and I had been friends since we were little, and we were excited about this sleepover. The mattress I was sleeping on was on the floor in her room, and I had positioned it in a way where if I sat up, I could see straight down the hallway into the living room. Amy was always a bit of a scaredy cat. Everything frightened her, the sound of the wind, the creak of the house settling, and especially things outside at night. I remember her telling me once that she thought there was something lurking in the dark when she was alone in her room, a shadow that just moved when she wasn't looking. I would always try to convince her there was nothing to be scared of, but deep down, I knew that feeling. That small, nagging thought in the back of your mind that said maybe, just maybe, you weren't alone. We had stayed up late that night, talking about whatever 10-year-olds talk about when they're not supposed to be awake. It wasn't until the sound of dogs barking next door that the night took a different turn. Amy woke up, eyes wide, clutching the blanket to her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I could barely make out the barking, muffled from the distance, but Amy looked panicked. Her eyes darted around the room, and she tugged the blanket over her head like it would somehow protect her from whatever might be out there. "It's just dogs, Amy," I muttered, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Go back to sleep." But she didn't. Instead, she started to squirm, her hands gripping the mattress like she wanted to climb into bed with me. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't deny that I felt uneasy too, just a little. We'd both heard dogs bark before, but there was something different about the way they sounded that night. They weren't just barking, they were frantic, almost desperate. Still, I told her, "Amy, just go back to sleep. It's fine." Amy wasn't convinced, and after a few minutes, she finally gave up on the idea of trying to sleep in her own bed. She slid off the mattress and climbed into her mom's bed, leaving me alone in the quiet room. The dogs kept barking, but they faded into the background as I finally drifted off to sleep. I woke up early, long before the sun fully rose. It was one of those mornings where the light was just beginning to creep in, but it wasn't fully day yet. The room was still bathed in a dim, quiet light, and I stretched out, feeling the coolness of the morning air. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, still half asleep, but something wasn't right. I sat up on the mattress, the soft creak of the floor beneath me making me pause. I glanced down the hallway, my eyes naturally drawn to the living room. That's when I saw her. Amy's aunt, Sandra, was sitting on the couch, staring directly at me. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was only 5:15 a.m., and Sandra, as far as I knew, wasn't supposed to be here. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and it wasn't like Sandra to show up this early. She was in the Air Force, and usually, when she visited, it was during the holidays, or sometimes in between her deployment leave. But even then, she wasn't the type to show up unannounced at such an odd hour. She sat there, still as a statue, just staring. Her eyes were wide open, focused entirely on me. There was something about the way she looked at me that made my skin crawl. I felt my throat tighten, but I couldn't look away. The silence between us stretched out, the ticking of the old clock in the corner, the only sound that filled the space. After what felt like an eternity, Sandra finally looked away, breaking the uncomfortable gaze. She turned her head, but instead of moving, she just sat there, her body still as ever. I could barely make out her silhouette in the dim light, the edges of her features blurred by the shadows. Confused and still unsettled, I lay back down, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I closed my eyes, willing myself to go back to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. My heart pounded in my chest, and my thoughts raced. I kept thinking about Sandra. Why was she just sitting there? Why was she staring at me like that? I finally drifted back into a restless sleep, but it didn't last long. Hours later, I woke up again, more alert this time. The sun was finally up, pouring light into the room, but the unease lingered. I stretched and yawned, rubbing my eyes as I got up. I padded into the kitchen where Amy's mom was already up, moving around and making breakfast. "Morning," I said, trying trying to shake off the weird dream I'd had. "Good morning," she replied, smiling at me. "Did you sleep well?" I nodded, though I didn't really feel like I had. The image of Sandra sitting on the couch, staring at me, still haunted my mind. I hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Where's Aunt Sandra? Is she still here?" Amy's mom looked at me with a puzzled expression. "Sandra? Sandra's not here, sweetie. She's in city right now. She won't be here for a while." My stomach dropped. I stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. But she was sitting on the couch this morning. I saw her. It was like 5:15 a.m. Amy's mom blinked at me, clearly confused. "No, sweetheart, she's not here. She's in city with her husband, visiting family." I could feel my heart race as the realization hit me. There was no way it could have been Sandra. I knew what I had seen, but the more I thought about it, the more the whole thing seemed impossible. It wasn't a dream. It couldn't have been. I had been wide awake, fully conscious, and there was someone sitting on that couch, staring at me. But who? I never mentioned it to anyone else after that day. It was something that gnawed at me, something I couldn't explain, and it never really left my mind. Even now, years later, I remember it as vividly as if it happened yesterday. I don't know what happened that morning. I don't know who, or what, was sitting on that couch. Maybe it was someone who looked like Sandra. Maybe it was a mistake of the mind, an odd trick of sleep, but part of me knows what I saw. I remember the way she stared at me, the way the room felt cold and heavy in those moments, like something wasn't right. It was one of those memories that, no matter how much time passed, would always feel out of place in the world of rational explanation. But sometimes, as I lie awake in bed at night, I think about that moment. I think about Sandra, or whoever it was, sitting there in the dim light, just staring at me. And even now, I still can't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. I was driving home one night, just a typical evening, winding through the quiet residential streets of my neighborhood. The air outside was cool, the kind of breeze that made you roll your windows down and listen to the hum of the tires on the asphalt. It was late enough that there weren't many cars on the road. It had been a long day, and I was looking forward to just getting home, sitting down and relaxing. I turned onto a street I usually drive down to cut through to my house, a street lined with older homes, each one with small front yards. The streetlights cast long shadows over the road, but it wasn't too dark, just enough for me to see clearly ahead. But then, as I was getting closer to the middle of the block, I saw something that immediately made me tense up. There was a guy standing right in the middle of the road. Not on the sidewalk, not by a driveway or anything, but directly in the middle of the street. At first, I thought maybe he was just standing there, waiting for a break in traffic or trying to get someone's attention. But then I noticed his movements. He was waving his arms around, almost like he was trying to flag me down, but in a frantic way. I slowed down, my foot instinctively moving to the brake pedal. Something felt off. I was too far from the curb, and there was no car in sight around him, so I couldn't figure out why he was standing there. I crept closer, thinking maybe I could get around him, but then he did something that made my heart jump into my throat. He suddenly jumped right in front of my car, no hesitation, like he was trying to stop me. I slammed on my brakes, the tires screeching as I came to a halt just inches from him. I had no idea what the hell was going on, but the whole situation felt wrong. The guy didn't move. He just stood there, now yelling something. I couldn't make it out at first. His voice was distant, muffled by the sound of my car's engine, but it was loud enough that I could tell he was shouting something in desperation. "You have to help me," he screamed over and over again. His voice was high-pitched, full of panic and raw fear. The kind of sound that sends a chill down your spine, the kind of urgency that makes your blood run cold. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. My instinct was to drive away, but I wasn't sure if I could. He wasn't just standing there anymore. He was pacing back and forth, his hands still flailing around in the air like he was trying to get my attention or, who knows, maybe trying to stop traffic for some reason I couldn't understand. He was shaking, his whole body trembling, as if he was on the edge of a breakdown. I cracked my window a little, just enough to hear him better, but still keeping a good distance between us. I was on edge, my mind racing to piece together what was happening. "You have to help me," he screamed again, his words barely making sense as they mixed with a lot of other jumbled, incoherent phrases. It was like he was lost in a panic, saying whatever came to his mind. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a woman's voice. She was standing in front of a house, shouting too. The woman's voice sounded just as desperate, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. She was too far away, and her voice cracked as she yelled. My stomach churned. This was all way too much. I could hear both of them yelling at the same time. The guy still shouting his plea for help, and the woman now screaming her own words, almost like she was trying to get my attention too. I had no idea what was going on, but I was starting to get a bad feeling about the whole situation. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know if I should stay and listen, or if I should just drive away. But before I could make a decision, the guy suddenly moved. He jogged over to my passenger side, and before I could even react, he tried to open the door. My heart stopped as I realized what was happening. He was trying to get in my car. I had locked the doors earlier, but still, the sheer audacity of it made me freeze for a second. He tugged at the handle, yanking it repeatedly. His eyes were wide, crazed, like he had completely lost it. I locked eyes with him through the window. His face was wild, sweaty, and his hair was matted with whatever he had been through. He looked disheveled, his clothes were torn, and he had a look in his eyes like he had no idea what he was doing. It was like he wasn't fully there. It was unsettling, to say the least. I knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't risk this guy getting in my car, or doing who knows what. I quickly shifted into drive, my heart racing. But just as I was about to hit the gas, I saw him running around to the back of the car, presumably to try the driver's side door next. I didn't think twice, I floored it. My foot pressed down hard on the accelerator, and the car surged forward. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. He punched my left rear window. The sound of his fist slamming against the glass was deafening. It felt like my entire body jolted from the impact. I had no idea how the window didn't shatter. It cracked slightly, but it held together. It wasn't just a quick punch either. It was like he put everything into it, his whole body weight behind that blow. I didn't want to know what would happen if he got any closer. I kept my foot down, my hands gripping the wheel so hard that my knuckles were white. My mind was racing, and the adrenaline was flooding my system. I was driving way faster than I normally would, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. As I turned onto the next main street, I saw headlights approaching. Another car was coming from the opposite direction. They slowed down as they got closer, and the driver rolled down his window. He looked at me, his eyes wide with concern. I could tell he had seen what was going on. He asked if I was okay, if I needed help. I told him about the guy who tried to get in my car. My voice was shaky, but I managed to get the words out. The other driver didn't hesitate. He immediately cranked a U-turn in the middle of the street, heading back in the direction I had just come from. He wasn't sticking around to find out what else could happen. I understood. He wasn't waiting to see if there was more trouble, and I wasn't either. I just wanted to get the hell out of that area. I didn't look back again. I drove straight home, my hands still shaking on the wheel. The adrenaline was still pumping through my body, making it hard to focus. I pulled into my driveway, still on edge. I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to calm myself down. The whole thing felt surreal, like a nightmare that I just couldn't wake up from. It took me a while to shake off the feeling. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't locked my doors, or if I had been just a few seconds slower. I felt lucky, no doubt, but also shaken. The whole situation felt random, like something that didn't belong in my quiet neighborhood. Later, I heard from a neighbor that the guy had been acting strangely for a while. Apparently, he'd been wandering around the area for days, sometimes talking to himself, sometimes just standing in the street, blocking traffic. I don't know if it was drugs, mental health issues, or something else, but after that night, I couldn't help but feel relieved that I hadn't stuck around to find out. Things went back to normal, eventually. But every time I drive down that street now, I can't help but glance around, checking to make sure nothing's out of place. I still don't know what that guy was trying to do, but one thing's for sure. I'll never forget the feeling of his fist on my car window, the crazed look in his eyes, and the adrenaline of getting away. It was the kind of experience that makes you realize just how quickly things can turn strange and terrifying, and how lucky I was to get out of there without anything worse happening. I used to work an overnight shift in a downtown office building from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. It wasn't the ideal shift, but it paid the bills. I worked on the 14th floor, which was mostly empty, save for a few late-night workers scattered around. For the most part, it was quiet, save for the occasional tapping of keyboards, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, and the city noises creeping in from the outside. On my lunch breaks, I'd usually take a quick nap. There was a part of the building that wasn't in use much at night, the second floor. It was a long, quiet space, perfect for a nap when everyone else was busy. It was colder down there, especially in the winter, since they turned the heat off after hours. That suited me, though. I'd use my coat as a blanket, and the chill would help me fall asleep quickly. The second floor was eerie in its silence. The hallway stretched out in front of me, with soft gray carpeting and beige walls, decorated with framed artwork that barely seemed to make an impression. The waiting area for the conference rooms was the best spot for me to sleep. The chairs were comfortable, and if I moved them around just right, I could create a little bed behind one of the pillars. It was the perfect little hideaway. The only issue was that the lights in that area were a little messed up. They were wired backward. They would always stay on unless you walked into the area. Then, they'd turn off automatically, which meant that if I wanted to nap, I had to keep my eyes covered with my coat or a scarf. But it wasn't too bad. By the time I settled in and the lights shut off, I'd usually be asleep within a few minutes. It was around 3:30 a.m. on one of those nights when I decided to take my usual nap. I had been working for hours already, and the quiet of the second floor seemed to be calling to me. I pushed the chairs together behind the pillar, made myself comfortable, and closed my eyes. Not even a minute later, something felt wrong. I heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. They were the kind of footsteps that echoed off the empty walls, steady, heavy, like someone with purpose. And along with the footsteps came the distinct sound of keys jangling, like a janitor walking down the hallway with his ring of keys. I didn't think much of it at first. I just laid still, figuring it was someone doing their rounds. They'd probably pass by without a word, and I could stay asleep in peace. But as the footsteps got closer, I realized something was off. The sound of the keys kept jangling, but it wasn't getting any closer. The footsteps continued, but they seemed to stop at the corner of the hallway. It was as if whoever was walking had stopped and was just standing there, marching in place. The keys kept jingling, but they never moved past me. I waited for what felt like an eternity, wondering if this person was just messing with me, trying to wake me up. I tried to stay still, afraid that if I moved, I'd draw attention to myself. I didn't want to get in trouble for sleeping there. The lights above me remained on, casting a pale glow across the floor. Time seemed to stretch. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, the only sound in the otherwise quiet hall. After what felt like a minute, or maybe it was longer, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see what was going on. What was this person doing? Why were they just standing there, marching in place like that? I gathered the strength to lift my head, but when I tried, I couldn't move. I struggled, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to roll over, to sit up, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, unable to move my arms or legs. I could barely manage to crack my eyes open just a little, enough to let in a sliver of light. Panic flooded me. This wasn't normal. It wasn't sleepiness. It wasn't anything I recognized. And then, the lights suddenly shut off with a soft click. The footsteps didn't stop. The keys kept jingling, but now they were coming closer. The sound of them was overwhelming, deafening in the silence that had fallen. I could hear them getting closer and closer, the jangling of keys louder in my ears. But I still couldn't move. I could feel the weight of something heavy pressing down on my chest, as if someone, or something, had climbed on top of me. The sensation was suffocating. I could feel large hands pressing against me, pinning me to the ground. I tried to scream. I tried to push whatever it was off of me, but my arms and legs wouldn't move. My mouth was frozen shut. I couldn't even open my eyes all the way. The weight on my chest was unbearable. It felt like it was crushing me, like there was something large and powerful holding me down, preventing me from breathing. I was trapped. The panic surged through me, but I couldn't do anything about it. The sound of the keys was right above me now, jangling in my ears like a bad dream. The weight pressed harder, and I could feel myself starting to sweat, the cold air of the building mixing with the clamminess of my skin. My heart raced faster, and the pressure on my chest only seemed to grow stronger. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the weight lifted. The hands were gone, the footsteps faded, and the keys jingled off into the distance. I was left lying there, gasping for breath, my body still frozen, but the pressure was gone. I slowly managed to open my eyes a little more. The hallway was empty. The lights were off, but the sound of the keys had disappeared completely. The hallway was silent again, except for the distant noise of the city streets far below. I tried to sit up, to move, but the moment I lifted my head, I noticed something that sent a wave of horror through me. The chairs I had pushed together were no longer where I had left them. They were scattered across the floor, pushed away from the pillar, right out into the middle of the hallway. The position of them made no sense. They weren't where I'd arranged them. They weren't even close to where I had originally laid down. I was confused. My heart was still racing, but I couldn't understand what had happened. The lights were still off, and now, everything was dead quiet. There was no sign of the janitor, no footsteps, no keys. It was as though the whole event had never happened. But I could feel it. The unease. The dread. It was real. I had been completely immobilized, trapped by something I couldn't explain. And then, as I sat up, a low, droning sound filled the air, a low electric hum, coming from somewhere overhead. I felt it in my bones, a faint, eerie vibration that seemed to come from the lights themselves. I wiped the sweat from my face, using my jacket to blot my forehead. But when I pulled the jacket away, everything changed. I was back in my original spot, behind the pillar, as if nothing had happened at all. The chairs were back where they belonged, and the lights overhead were on again. The hum had stopped. Everything seemed normal, except for the fact that I was shaken to my core. I grabbed my things in a daze and hurried back upstairs to my office on the 14th floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something that I couldn't explain. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but that experience felt real. It felt too real. The next day, I mentioned what happened to a coworker. He laughed at first, but then he got serious. He told me that during the construction of the building, a worker had committed suicide on the second floor. Apparently, some people had reported seeing his ghost walking through empty rooms or hearing the sound of keys jingling late at night. I didn't believe in any of that. It was just a story, right? But the way my coworker told it, I couldn't help but feel a chill down my spine. We laughed it off, but I couldn't forget the feeling, the heaviness, the weight on my chest, the impossible stillness that had surrounded me. Whatever it was, I didn't want to experience it again, and I never did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that building, something in those walls, would never let me forget. Something had happened that night, and it wasn't just a bad dream. The air in my dorm room always felt a little too still, like it was holding its breath. The kind of stillness that creeps into your bones, making you uncomfortable without really understanding why. My roommate, Megan, and I had been living in the same space for a few months now, and aside from the usual college stress, late night studying, early morning classes, the typical student hustle, we'd gotten into a routine. But there was something about that room, something I couldn't quite explain, that unsettled me. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that screamed for attention, but things happened in there. Small things, weird things, things that didn't make sense. It started small at first. My bedside lamp would turn on and off by itself. At first, I just thought it was the switch being faulty, but when I checked it, nothing was wrong with it. The bulb wasn't loose, the cord wasn't frayed, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It wasn't the kind of thing that would make you panic immediately, but it was unsettling. I mentioned it to Megan a few times, but she just shrugged it off, saying that maybe I was just tired or imagining things. Then there were the other strange occurrences. My things, books, papers, pens, would slide across my desk as if someone had just nudged them, but no one was there. Megan had gone home for the weekend, and I'd been alone. I kept telling myself it was just the vibrations from the building settling, maybe from someone walking down the hall or something shifting in the walls. But it didn't stop. And honestly, I started to feel like I was losing my mind a little. We'd gotten used to it though. Not exactly comfortable, but used to it. I'd come to expect it. After a while, it felt like just another part of living in a dorm, where things were constantly changing, where no one ever really had their own space, and where weird stuff just kind of happened. Megan never seemed bothered by any of it, so I decided to stop worrying about it. But everything changed one afternoon when Megan was gone for the weekend. I had the room to myself, and I decided to take a nap. I was exhausted from running errands, going to class, and trying to keep up with assignments. It had been a long week. So I climbed into bed, pulled the covers up, and let myself drift off. At first, my nap was peaceful, but then the dream started. It wasn't like my usual dreams, which were usually just jumbled bits of my day. No, this one was different. It was vivid. It felt real. In my dream, I was walking through the familiar streets near campus, running errands, heading to class, just the normal things. But then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared behind me. It was a shadow, a black figure with a tall, thin shape, carrying a staff of some sort. I could see its face, though, even though it was all black. Huge eyes, white teeth, and a wide, unsettling grin. It wasn't just following me, though. It was watching me, and I could feel its gaze, cold and malicious. I knew it wasn't just a random figure, some random shadow. I knew it, and I knew that I'd seen it before. This was the same thing that had been lingering around me for days. The dread that had built up in me over the past few weeks suddenly flooded my chest. I knew it was no accident. This figure had been following me for a long time, and it had finally decided to show itself. I remember thinking, "Oh, it's you," like I was somehow both terrified and resigned to the fact that this thing had been stalking me. It didn't speak, but its presence felt so suffocating, like it was taunting me. I tried to keep walking, but I could feel it getting closer, its footsteps matching mine, its grin widening. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move faster than the shadow. I could hear it laughing, not in words, but in the way its grin seemed to grow wider and wider. It wasn't a laugh of joy, it was mocking. I felt powerless. It was as if I was being drawn into its dark embrace, and there was no escape. That's when I woke up. I jolted upright in my bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, and for a split second, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I looked over at the edge of my raised bed, and there it was. The same figure, the same black shape, grinning. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my imagination. The thing I had just seen in my dream was right there in front of me, and it was grinning at me, just like it had in the dream. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that when I opened them again, it would be gone. But when I opened them, it was right on top of me. I could feel its weight, its presence. It was suffocating. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe. I tried to move, to push it away, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, trapped in some kind of nightmare, unable to scream, unable to fight. I couldn't even blink, couldn't even look away. It was like the air around me had thickened, and I was being pressed into the bed, unable to escape. Time didn't make sense. It could have been seconds, it could have been hours, but finally, I was able to sit upright, gasping for air like I had just emerged from underwater. My eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the figure was gone. I was shaking, sweating, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached for the bedside lamp, fumbling with the switch, desperate for some light. But when I turned it on, it flickered and then went out. I stared at it, heart racing, my hands clammy. I tried again. Nothing. It wouldn't turn on. Panic surged through me. I wasn't thinking clearly. I couldn't think clearly. All I could do was beg, plead, as if that would somehow make the lamp work, make everything go back to normal. "Oh no, please no," I whispered, my voice barely audible as I turned it on once more. But again, it turned off. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay in that room, in that space. The feeling that something was watching me, something just out of sight, was overwhelming. My pulse thundered in my ears. I bolted out of the bed, still dizzy from the panic, and ran straight out of my room, into the hall. I didn't care about the rest of the building, about the other students, about anything. I just needed to get away. I didn't tell anyone. Not at first. I didn't want to sound crazy, even though I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. Megan came back the next day, and I pretended everything was fine. I kept it all inside, only telling my sweet mate Sarah. She was the only one I could talk to. She listened, didn't ask too many questions, but she could see how freaked out I was. In an attempt to comfort me, she gave me a small Buddha figure that she'd had since she was a kid. She said it brought her peace. I placed it next to my bed, hoping that it would somehow keep whatever it was at bay. But that wasn't the end of it. No, something even stranger happened the next day. My other sweet mate, Rachel, who lived on the other side of the shared bathroom, didn't know anything about what had happened to me. But she came to me the next morning, looking pale. She told me that she had seen something, a shadowy figure, a man, standing in the hallway outside her door. She had kept the door open that afternoon, and as she was sitting on her bed, she saw the figure standing there, watching her. It wasn't long before it turned away and began walking toward my room. She described it the same way I had seen it, a a shadow, a dark figure, and that same sense of dread. She didn't know what to make of it, but she knew she'd seen something. And it was then, at that exact moment, when I had been sleeping in my room, that the figure had moved toward me. It wasn't a coincidence. I knew that now. Whatever had been haunting my room had been watching me, following me, for longer than I could have imagined. And for some reason, it had decided to reveal itself that afternoon. That was the scariest part, knowing that this wasn't just a random occurrence. This wasn't just a sleep disorder or a trick of the light. This was something real, something that had been waiting. After that, things started to settle down. The strange occurrences stopped, the lamp didn't flicker anymore, and my things stayed where I left them. But I didn't forget. I couldn't. I didn't know what had really happened, but I knew that whatever it wasn't over. Maybe it never would be. But I still have the Buddha figure. It still sits next to my bed, and while I don't know if it helps, I haven't dared to get rid of it. I don't know what that thing was, or why it followed me, but I do know that it's not gone. Not really. And that thought has stuck with me ever since. I had been looking forward to the bike trip all year. It was something my best friend and I had talked about for ages, a 60-mile bike trail one way. We'd trained for it, planned it out, and were both excited to push ourselves. The idea was simple: ride the trail, get to the cabin where an old coworker of mine lived, stay the night, and then head back the next day. It sounded like a perfect plan. Little did I know that June of 2013 would become one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The day started out like any normal bike ride. My friend and I, both determined and energized, set out early in the morning. We had plenty of snacks packed and water to keep us hydrated. It was a nice sunny day, the kind where the sky is clear and the wind is just right. We hit the trail, our tires crunching over gravel and dirt, laughing and talking about anything and everything. Around 30 or 40 miles in, we hit a small area where the trees lined the sides of the trail, and we could see the cabin we were supposed to stay at. The man we used to work with, who was renting out cabins on the trail, had offered us a place to stay. He lived just down the street from the cabin, so we rode up, locked up our bikes, and walked up to the front door. The cabin was nice, a little rustic, but with electricity, heating, AC, a TV, and all the amenities you could need. We unpacked our stuff and settled in. We'd been warned about thunderstorms on the forecast, but we didn't think much of it. After all, we were in the woods, and the storm didn't seem like it would be too bad. But then, within an hour or so of arriving, the weather turned. The sky grew darker, the wind picked up, and soon it started to rain heavily. The thunder rumbled in the distance, and the power flickered out. The cabin was silent except for the storm outside. We made the decision to go to the man's house for dinner, where we'd be able to sit in a warm, dry place. His wife was there, and the three of us played cards while we ate. It was a nice, normal evening. But when we returned to the cabin afterward, things started to get strange. The storm was still raging outside, and the power had yet to come back on. We lit a few candles and tried to make the best of it. We sat down on the couches, bored, just passing time. It was quiet, except for the occasional flash of lightning outside and the booming thunder. We didn't really know what to do. That's when Scout, the man's dog, decided to join us. Scout was a large dog, kind of scruffy with a golden brown coat, and he immediately jumped up onto the couch next to me. He seemed to be content at first, curling up and getting comfortable. But then, something started to change. After a few minutes, Scout lifted his head slowly and stared intently into the corner of the room. His eyes were fixed, unwavering. He wasn't looking at us or anything else, just that dark corner. It wasn't like him to act this way, especially not when we were all just hanging out. I remember feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I watched him. My friend, who was sitting across from me, noticed too. She leaned in, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Hey, your dog. He keeps staring at that corner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded but didn't say anything, my eyes still on the dog. It was getting more unsettling by the second. Scout's body was still, but his gaze was unbroken. I felt a little cold, but I tried to brush it off. Dogs sometimes fixate on things. Maybe it was nothing. But then, my friend said something that sent a chill down my spine. "Wait, your speaker just moved." I turned around quickly, my heart pounding. The speaker above the TV, the one closest to that same corner, had shifted. It wasn't a big move, maybe just an inch or two, but it was enough to notice. It was like it had been nudged by something. Maybe the storm? But it didn't make sense. We were indoors. The windows were closed. No breeze. No explanation. My friend's face had gone pale. "I swear it just moved," she said, staring at the corner of the room, eyes wide. Scout's behavior only made it worse. His stare was unwavering, like he was tracking something that we couldn't see. At that point, I felt a cold knot settle in my stomach. My friend's breathing quickened, and I could see she was getting nervous. We heard something from upstairs then, a thud or a creak. It was hard to tell, but it was enough to make us both jump. I felt a rising sense of panic. I didn't know what was happening, but something didn't feel right. I had to get out of there. Without saying anything, we both stood up quickly. Scout didn't move from his spot, still staring at the corner. We grabbed our things and ran outside, stepping out onto the front porch. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees, and the air was thick with tension. I looked back at the cabin, but I couldn't bring myself to look inside. I didn't want to see anything else. We sat there on the porch, huddled together, the storm drowning out any other sound. It felt like we were trapped in a moment that was too strange, too unsettling to comprehend. I wanted to go home, but we were miles away from the nearest road, with no way to leave until morning. Then came the moment that really broke me. We were sitting there, still shaken, when my friend's phone buzzed. She had an iPhone, and I had my old flip phone, so I couldn't check anything, but she looked at her screen, and her face went white. "You won't believe this," she whispered. I turned toward her, confused. "What? What's wrong?" She handed me her phone. The notification on her Facebook was the first thing I saw. It said, my name, posted a photo on her timeline. But I hadn't posted anything. I wasn't on Facebook. I hadn't even thought about it. And I definitely wasn't using any internet or Wi-Fi. This was a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and we didn't have a signal. My friend had 3G, but that was it. My stomach dropped. "Did you post something?" she asked, her voice shaky. I shook my head. "No, I haven't even used Facebook in days." We stared at the notification, both of us confused. The photo had been posted in May, almost a month before our trip. The description caught me off guard. It wasn't anything I remembered writing. It said, "We never sleep." I didn't remember posting anything like that. I didn't even know what it meant. It didn't feel like me. My heart was pounding. It didn't make sense. Why would my friend get a notification about something I hadn't posted? Something from weeks ago. Why was the photo even on her phone? And why did it say that weird description? I felt dizzy, like I was losing my grip on reality. I looked at my friend, but she was just as freaked out as I was. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some weird glitch in the system, or a mistake on Facebook's end. But deep down, something about it felt too off, too wrong. The dog still hadn't moved from his spot, and we both decided it was best to go back inside, even though the last thing I wanted was to be in that cabin again. We ran upstairs and barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, pushing a dresser in front of the door. I could barely breathe, my heart racing with every passing second. The air felt thick, like something was pressing in on us. The dog, Scout, didn't follow us into the room. He stayed downstairs. We spent the rest of the night in that room, too afraid to sleep, listening to the storm and the occasional creaks from upstairs. Nothing else happened that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. That something was in that cabin, just waiting. In the morning, we left as soon as we could. We didn't even take the bikes down the trail. We just packed up and walked away, not looking back. We didn't talk much on the way out, both of us feeling like we'd just barely escaped something we couldn't understand. When we got back to the man's house to thank him for letting us stay, we tried to act normal. But something had shifted between us. The man didn't seem to notice, but we both knew that whatever had happened that night, it wasn't something we could explain. To this day, I still don't have an explanation for the Facebook post. I've tried to rationalize it, but it doesn't make sense. I've never seen that kind of notification again, and I've never experienced anything like that in my life. It still haunts me to think about that night, about the dog, the corner, the strange notification, and the fact that something felt so incredibly wrong in that cabin. I don't know what happened that night, but I'll never forget it. It's one of those things that, no matter how much I try to explain it away, it stays with me. That feeling of dread, of being watched, of knowing that something was out of place, will stay with me forever. And I'll never go back to that cabin again. We'd been working on the podcast for months now, and things were starting to come together. The idea was simple: explore unsolved, strange occurrences, delve into the unknown, interview people who'd been part of bizarre events, and see if we could make sense of it all. But one case was different from the rest. One case made me wish I'd never gotten involved in any of this. I'll never forget the day we decided to interview the woman. Her name was Emily, a former nanny and childminder who had been involved in some strange happenings a while back. It all started when she called the podcast, asking to share her side of the story. She had been involved in a case that caught the attention of several paranormal groups, but she was insistent that there was no supernatural explanation for what happened. She believed she had experienced something horrifying, but it was grounded in reality. There had been strange noises in the house, objects moving on their own, a sense of unease, but it didn't fit the ghost stories people often told. We weren't sure what to make of it at first. One of my team members, Lucas, was dead set on the idea that there was no such thing as the paranormal, and he would go to great lengths to prove it. But me, I was intrigued. We had solid evidence on some other interviews, things that couldn't be easily explained, and I figured if we had the chance to speak with Emily and get her side, maybe we could find something concrete. My producer, Nate, and I made arrangements to meet her at her apartment for an interview. The morning of the interview, Nate and I packed up our equipment, a few mics, some cameras, and some lighting gear. I wasn't nervous, but there was something about this case that felt different, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to walk into something we weren't prepared for. When we arrived at her apartment, we noticed the place was on the quieter side of the building, tucked away from the bustling street below. It was a small building, a little rundown, with peeling paint on the exterior. The kind of building where people come and go, but you never really know who they are. We knocked on her door at 2 p.m. sharp, the time we had arranged, but there was no answer. We knocked again, then a third time. I could hear movement inside, but it was as though she was deliberately ignoring the door. Nate began pacing outside, his patience wearing thin. "Maybe we should just leave," he said, his voice low and frustrated. "She's not here. Maybe we misread the time, or she changed her mind." But I didn't want to give up. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me, and I was determined to follow through. "She's in there, Nate. I can hear something moving." I had heard what sounded like a shuffle, maybe a footstep, or something heavy being dragged across the floor. We knocked once more, then I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The door wasn't locked. The handle turned easily in my hand, and before Nate could say anything, I pushed the door open a few inches. "Wait, we shouldn't," he started to say, but I was already inside, stepping cautiously into the hallway. The apartment was dim, with the blinds drawn and the air thick with the smell of stale air, old coffee, and something metallic. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was off, and I could sense it in my gut. "Emily?" I called softly, my voice echoing a little too loud in the empty space. There was no reply. The place felt unnervingly still. Nate hesitated in the doorway, then followed me in, his face filled with skepticism, but even he couldn't shake the unease in the air. We made our way down the narrow hallway, passing rooms that were dark and quiet. The apartment was small, almost cramped, and there was a sense of disorder, like someone had left in a hurry but forgot to clean up. But nothing could have prepared me for what we found when we reached the living room. The first thing I noticed was the blood. It was everywhere. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, some weird shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized the walls were literally painted with it. There were splatters on the ceiling, streaks down the furniture, and dark pools soaking into the carpet. It wasn't the kind of mess you make when you cut yourself. This was deliberate. This was something else entirely. Nate and I froze. I remember the buzzing sound then, a low, constant hum that seemed to fill the room. At first, I couldn't place it. My mind scrambled to find an explanation, but it was impossible to ignore. It sounded like flies. Hundreds of them, maybe more, and they were swarming over the scene in front of us. The blood, I realized, had attracted them, and the smell was thick in the air now, an overpowering metallic stench that made my stomach churn. My mouth went dry, and my legs almost gave out. I turned away from the mess in front of me and spotted something else. A body, hanging from the ceiling fan. I had to fight the wave of nausea rising in my throat. The woman, Emily, was gone. The sight of her body twisted unnaturally in the air, made me feel like I had just been punched in the chest. She had hung herself. The extension cord, still wrapped around her neck, swung gently as if she had only just been there. But the blood on the floor, the walls, it was all too much. I didn't want to go any further, but I couldn't look away. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had she been dead for hours? Days? It was impossible to tell. There was too much blood. There was too much of everything. My eyes were drawn to the overturned furniture, the broken glass. It was as if a struggle had taken place in this room, but there were no signs of it being a robbery or any sort of attack. It felt personal, violent, desperate. Nate was already on the phone with the authorities, his voice shaky, but I couldn't focus on anything except the image in front of me. I didn't hear what the dispatcher said to him, but I could tell he was speaking in a calm, clipped tone, probably trying to reassure him while sending help. I walked over to the nearest chair, pressing my hand against the back of it, trying to steady myself. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. I wanted to turn away, to forget what I was seeing, but I couldn't. I wanted to scream, but my throat was too dry. I just stood there, staring at the scene before me, my thoughts a jumbled mess. The buzzing. It was unbearable now. The flies were everywhere, crawling on the walls, on the furniture, on the floor. I heard them buzzing around my ears, like a swarm of angry bees. The sound felt like it was getting louder, like it was coming from inside my skull. It was maddening. The paramedics arrived soon after, and when they saw what we had found, they took over, their faces grim as they confirmed what we already knew. The apartment was sealed off, and the police arrived shortly after, questioning us about what we had seen. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't form a coherent sentence. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The image of Emily's body hanging in that apartment kept playing over and over in my mind, like a loop I couldn't escape. Even now, months later, I can still hear the buzzing of those damn flies. I can still see the blood, the broken furniture, the mess. My sleep is always restless. The nightmares come and go, but they never fully leave. I've had chronic insomnia since that day, and every time I close my eyes, I feel like I'm back in that apartment. I'm back in that room, with the blood and the flies and the horror that I'll never be able to forget. I don't know what happened in that apartment, and I don't know if I ever will. But I know one thing. I should have listened to Nate. We shouldn't have gone in. But we did, and now I live with it every day. And I don't think that's something I'll ever be able to outrun. It was an early Saturday morning, the kind of morning when the sun just starts to peek out over the horizon and the air is still cool, crisp, and quiet. I woke up with a strange feeling, almost like an impulse. There was no real reason for it, no specific thought driving me, but I just knew I needed to get up and go for a walk. It wasn't something I'd normally do, especially on a Saturday, but there was something inside me telling me it was the right thing to do. I couldn't explain it at the time, and even now, years later, I still don't fully understand it. It was just one of those moments where your body moves before your mind can catch up. I got dressed quickly, slipped into my sneakers, and headed outside. The streets were quiet, and the air smelled faintly of dew and freshly mowed grass. I walked with no particular destination in mind, just moving for the sake of moving, the quiet of the early morning surrounding me. As I walked, memories from my middle school days flooded back. I remembered him. His name was Daniel. He and I had been best friends during 7th grade. We became inseparable after our surgeries. I had my leg surgery, the one where they fixed my knee after that accident, and he had his spine surgeries. A bunch of them, actually. There was a hole in his spine that doctors tried to repair over and over again. He never really talked about the details, but I knew it was bad. I think that's why we clicked so well. We both understood what it felt like to be trapped in your own body, unable to do the things you wanted to do, always in pain, always feeling different. We spent hours together after school, either hanging out in my room or his, telling stories about the stupid things we wished we could do if our bodies allowed us. We tried pranks on each other. I'd hide his crutches, and he'd steal my crutches. Stupid, harmless things, but they made us laugh. He knew things about me that no one else did. He knew about my fears, my dreams, and the things I was too shy to tell even my parents. In return, I knew about his struggles, his frustrations, and the little things he tried to hide behind his jokes. He was a bit of a clown, always joking around, but I knew it was his way of dealing with everything. It was in those months that I started to feel like I wasn't alone anymore, like there was someone who understood me better than anyone. When he left school at the beginning of 8th grade, I felt like I lost a part of myself. It didn't make sense, but it felt like a huge chunk of my world had been ripped out. He moved to a different district, and that was the last time I saw him, at least in person. For years, I didn't hear from him. No texts, no calls, no emails. Nothing. I thought about him often, wondering what had happened, what he was up to, but I didn't reach out. He had a new life, and so did I. I didn't want to be that person who reached out after so long. I didn't want to be awkward about it. So we both moved on in silence, though I'll admit I missed him. Then, out of nowhere, on a Saturday afternoon in the fall of my 10th grade year, I had this strange urge to walk. The kind of urge that I couldn't shake. My mind wasn't thinking about him, not consciously anyway, but somehow, I ended up near the park that we used to go to together when we were younger. It was one of those places where you just felt like time stood still, where nothing changed. I didn't even know why I was there, but as I walked past the familiar trees, the swing set, and the old bench near the pond, I felt something in the air that made me pause. And then I saw him. He was standing by the park, walking toward the small convenience store. His face was a little older, a little more worn, but there was no mistaking him. It was Daniel. For a moment, I just stood there, not sure if I should approach him. He looked like he was in a hurry, but then he saw me. His face lit up with that grin I hadn't seen in years. We both froze for a second, and then he started walking toward me. I couldn't believe it. After all these years, here he was in front of me, just like old times. We hugged, and I remember feeling how strange it was. It was like time had never passed between us, but at the same time, everything felt different. We spent hours together, just catching up. He told me about his life, about the surgeries that hadn't worked, about how he was finally starting to feel somewhat normal again. He had a new job, he said, helping his mom with bills, and he was living in the area now, though I wasn't sure where. We sat at the park, talking about everything and nothing. He even joked about how I still looked the same, though I knew we had both changed. We laughed, reminisced, and talked about the things we used to do. It felt like nothing had ever changed. But of course, everything had. By the time we parted ways, it was already getting late. I didn't want to leave, but I had to. He said he'd be around more often, and promised we'd stay in touch this time. I didn't think much of it at the time, but there was something unsettling about our meeting. Something about the way he had looked at me as we said goodbye, like he knew something I didn't. The next day, Sunday, I didn't think much about it. I went about my usual routine, tried to put it all in the back of my mind. I hadn't heard from Daniel yet, but I didn't expect to immediately. He had his life, and I had mine. I figured we'd catch up again when we could. But then, in the evening, I got a call. It was from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a voice on the other end told me that Daniel had been in a serious accident. He'd been riding his friend's bike and collided with a truck. I froze. I didn't know what to say. I thought it was a prank at first, but when the voice on the other end mentioned his mom, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't process it. It felt like someone had hit me over the head with a sledgehammer. I had just seen him, just talked to him. How could this be real? How could something like this happen so suddenly, so quickly? Daniel was in a coma for 3 days before he passed away. I couldn't believe it. The world felt like it had been pulled out from under me. I couldn't make sense of it. How could it be possible that the last time I saw him, everything felt so normal, so full of life? And now he was gone. His mom called me after he passed. She said that the last thing Daniel had done before leaving the house that day was search the entire house for a book he had borrowed from me. It was a silly little book, nothing special, but it was the last thing he had done. He hadn't been able to find it, but he was still looking for it when he left. His mom said that was the last thing he mentioned before he left the house. I'm going to give it back to him. That hit me harder than anything else. I hadn't seen him for 4 years, and then, the day before his accident, I just happened to run into him. I hadn't planned it. It just happened. And then, he had been looking for that book. For me. I still don't know what to make of it. Why had he been looking for the book? Why had he even thought about it after all this time? We hadn't talked in years. There was no reason for him to remember something so small, so trivial. But somehow it felt significant. It felt like he had known something was going to happen, like he was trying to make sure he finished something, even if it was something so simple as finding a book he had borrowed from me years ago. The whole thing haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a coincidence. The fact that I had met him the day before, the fact that he had been looking for that book, the fact that everything seemed so normal, and then it was all gone in an instant. It was too much to handle. In the years that followed, I couldn't bring myself to drive a vehicle. I couldn't even sit in the passenger seat without feeling uneasy. The accident, Daniel's death, it all left a mark on me. Every time I saw a bike, every time I saw a truck, I thought about it. I thought about how fragile life really is, how quickly everything can change. I couldn't help but wonder if there was some kind of cosmic reason why I met him that day. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But I can't shake the feeling that our meeting wasn't just random, that it was some kind of warning. I'll never know for sure, but I can't get rid of the feeling that Daniel was trying to tell me something, even if he didn't realize it himself. Now, every time I drive by that park where we met, I can't help but think of him. The memories flood back, the laughter, the stories, the way it felt like nothing had changed. And then I remember the last thing he did, searching for that book, and it feels like the strangest kind of closure, though it's not really closure at all. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see his face, and I can still hear his laugh. And I wonder if I'll ever truly understand why he had to leave so suddenly. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget him, and I'll never stop wondering what might have been if we had more time. But life doesn't wait for you to figure it all out. It keeps moving, keeps changing, and you just have to keep going with it, even when it doesn't make sense. I had been in medical school for almost 3 years when I found myself rotating through the obstetrics and gynecology department. It wasn't my first time on the labor and delivery floor, but every time I stepped into the sterile, quiet chaos of that place, it felt a little like stepping into a different world. The first time you hear a baby's cry after delivery is like a small miracle, and I had been lucky enough to be present for many births, some of which had been routine, others a little more dramatic, but none quite like this one. That day started like any other on the floor. The hum of machines, the clinking of nurses' shoes against the tiled floor, the busy buzz of doctors and residents moving quickly between rooms. I had been assigned to assist with deliveries, my first real taste of what it would be like in the future. It felt like the first day of my real medical career, where I was expected to be more than just a student watching from the sidelines. I had to pay attention to every detail, every moment. I wasn't expecting anything unusual when the woman came in. She was in her early 30s, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, eyes wide and tired but not panicked. She was in mild labor, which meant it wasn't quite time for delivery yet, but the contractions were frequent enough to warrant monitoring. Her husband stood beside her, looking nervous, but doing his best to reassure her. It wasn't her first baby. She had 2 older children already, both of them in the waiting room with a friend of hers. The mood in the room was calm, a soft contrast to the normal hectic atmosphere I was getting used to. As part of my routine, I asked her what they were planning to name the baby. It was a harmless question, one I asked every time. Some parents were still undecided, others had the name already picked out. When she told me the name was going to be Astra, something about it caught my attention. It was an unusual name, one I hadn't heard before, but it was the coincidence that really struck me. The night before, I had a dream that I delivered a baby named Sunny. I remember the vivid feeling of holding the baby in my arms, a little girl with bright, clear eyes, and in my dream, I knew her name was Sunny, like a star, a bright point in the sky. I hadn't given the dream much thought, but hearing the name Astra, which sounded somewhat similar to star, immediately made me think of it. I didn't mention the dream to anyone, though. I didn't think there was any point, but there was something strange in the air that I couldn't quite shake off. Her 2 older children had unusual names too, though I couldn't recall them in that moment. They seemed to follow a cosmic theme, names that belonged to stars or constellations, names that were different, unique, but not entirely out of place. I made a mental note to ask her about the names later, but for now, the focus was on her and the baby. Time passed as the contractions picked up, and the atmosphere shifted from calm to more urgent. The nurse came in to check the fetal heart rate, and everything seemed normal. But I was starting to feel that strange twinge of discomfort, the one you get when you know something is about to happen, and it's out of your control. The moments before delivery always felt like this for me. It was a quiet anticipation, a stillness that everyone in the room shared, waiting for the next moment. When the nurse confirmed that the baby was ready, we all suited up. The attending physician hadn't arrived yet, so it was just the resident and me, getting ready for what seemed like it was going to be another smooth delivery. I watched as the resident checked the mother's position, making sure everything was in order. There's a rhythm to these things, an unspoken understanding between the medical team. The resident and I exchanged a quick look, acknowledging that things were moving along well. The mother was pushing, but she was calm. Her husband was by her side, holding her hand, trying to be as supportive as possible. That's when the attending physician walked in. He was always a bit late, and he had this nonchalant air about him that, for some reason, always rubbed me the wrong way. He was well respected, a veteran in the field, but there was something about his presence that never made me feel completely comfortable. It wasn't that he was unkind or dismissive. He was just a little too casual, a little too disconnected from the chaos of the situation. He apologized briefly, explaining that he had biked in and was running late. That didn't surprise me. He had always been a little odd that way, biking everywhere, always in a hurry. He suited up quickly and took the lead, sitting down on the stool right in front of the mother's legs, ready to catch the baby as it came. At this point, the room was filled with a soft quiet. The only sounds were the rustling of the attending physician's gown and the occasional grunt of the mother as she pushed. But something odd caught my eye, something that immediately made my stomach turn. As I glanced at the attending physician's head, I noticed something crawling in his hair, small, fly-like insects. I couldn't immediately tell what they were, but they were moving quickly, almost as if they had been there for some time. I looked at the resident beside me, my expression one of disbelief. We were both horrified. The resident was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper as she pointed to his head. "Doc, you've got some bugs on your head." I thought she was joking at first, but then I saw her face. She wasn't smiling, her brow furrowed with genuine concern. The attending physician, not seeming to notice the insect crawling all over his scalp, casually shrugged it off. "Ah, I biked through a whole swarm of them," he said, as though this was the most normal thing in the world. He didn't even pause to brush them away. He simply continued what he was doing, preparing to deliver the baby. I wasn't sure what to do. The resident didn't seem sure either, but she started trying to scoop the bugs out of his hair as best as she could. The moment felt like a surreal, almost horrifying lapse in reality. There was something about it, the idea of bugs crawling on the head of the attending physician, the way he casually brushed off the concern, as if he didn't even notice. The whole situation was off. Then the baby was born. As the baby came out, I was immediately struck by the unusual shape of its head. It was obvious to everyone in the room, something wasn't right. There was a large, flat depression on the baby's skull, right in the area where the attending physician had bugs crawling. The head was smaller than it should have been, and the deformity was startling. It was the kind of thing you never want to see, the kind of thing you never want to acknowledge. In those moments after delivery, there's always a terrible silence. It's the silence where everyone in the room knows something is wrong, but no one knows exactly how to address it. The mother, still breathing heavily, looked at the baby and asked the question we all feared. "Is everything okay?" It was the worst moment, that moment of realization. No one knew how to answer. The attending physician, despite his usual nonchalance, looked over at the baby's head, his expression faltering for just a second before he regained his composure. He nodded to the pediatrician, who had come in to check the baby, and the room seemed to fall into a sort of eerie stillness. The pediatrician confirmed that there was something wrong, something that needed to be investigated. The baby was diagnosed with Sturge-Weber syndrome, a rare neurological condition that causes a variety of issues, including developmental delays and seizures. The birthmark on the baby's face, a deep red mark that ran from the temple to the jawline, was a clear sign of the condition. I don't know what it was, but the whole experience left me feeling hollow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off, that somehow everything had been leading up to this moment. The dream from the night before, the name Astra, the strange encounter with the bugs on the doctor's head, it all felt too much like a coincidence to be brushed off. But what was the connection? What did it all mean? I didn't have answers, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed the events of the day over and over, trying to find some logic, something to explain it all. But I couldn't. In the end, the baby went on to receive the care she needed, and the parents were informed about the diagnosis. The family left the hospital, taking their daughter with them, and I continued my rotation as I had to. But the strange, unsettling feeling never really left me. There was something in the air that day, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And though I had been in that hospital for countless births, none of them felt quite like this one. I remember this one evening during my time in the army, when something happened that none of us could ever explain, but also something that was so simple that it made everything feel off. And to this day, I still don't know what really went down. It was right after dinner, and we were all in the bunk area, unwinding after a long, exhausting day of drills and exercises. We didn't have a lot of downtime, so when we got it, we'd just lay around and talk, mess around, or nap. A normal evening, at least until our officer came through. He was a strict guy, always on us for something. But that night he was doing one of his routine checks, just walking through the bunk to make sure everyone had locked up their stuff. We were all pretty used to it by then, so no one really paid much attention until he stopped by one of the lockers at the end of the row. I remember him bending down and squinting at something that looked out of place. At first, I thought maybe he was checking something on the floor, but then I saw him stand up straight, holding what looked like a sandwich. A damn sandwich. Now, I know that might not seem like a big deal, but let me explain. We were in the middle of nowhere, on some godforsaken base, and food like that didn't just magically appear. We weren't supposed to have snacks in our lockers. Our lockers were supposed to be empty when we weren't using them, and the only food we had access to was what the mess hall provided, which was pretty basic and certainly not something you'd stash away in a locker. "Who left this in here?" he asked, holding up the sandwich in front of everyone. His voice was steady, but I could tell he was pissed. Nobody said anything. The room went silent, the kind of silence where everyone's just waiting for someone else to fess up. But no one did. I mean, it was just a sandwich, but it was breaking the rules, and breaking the rules meant punishment. After a few seconds, the officer set the sandwich down on a nearby desk and turned to the guys who had lockers near the one it was found in. "This is a joke, right?" he asked them. "You think I'm playing games here?" The guys just looked around, not making eye contact with him or anyone else. It wasn't until he stepped closer that one of the guys, I think it was Jackson, muttered something about not knowing how it got there. That just set the officer off more. Jackson wasn't the brightest, but he was tough. He'd gotten away with a lot of stuff before, but this time, there was no escape. The officer didn't even wait for him to finish before he told all of them to get in line. "You're all getting PT'd after dinner," the officer said, his tone sharp. "All of you. Don't think you're getting out of this one." And so, after we finished eating, we found ourselves back in the yard, doing push-ups, sit-ups, and every other miserable exercise you can think of. We weren't exactly thrilled, but we did it, one by one, until our arms were sore and our muscles felt like they were going to give out. By the time we were done, everyone was exhausted, drenched in sweat, but it wasn't over. Oh no, that sandwich had more consequences than anyone had expected. Back in the bunk, the guys who'd been caught near the locker started to argue. No one knew how the sandwich had gotten in there, but everyone wanted to blame someone else. Jackson, the guy who'd been closest to the locker, was the first to throw out the idea that it was a ghost. I know, it sounds ridiculous, but in the moment, it made a certain kind of sense. Everyone was worn out, and the idea of a supernatural cause, some spirit playing tricks on us, seemed to lighten the mood a little. It was a weird joke, but nobody could come up with anything else. So Jackson laughed and said something like, "Well, if it was a ghost, maybe it'll put a sandwich in my locker next time." That kind of set the tone for the rest of the evening. They all started laughing, but it was a nervous laugh, a forced one. Everyone was still tense from the PT, and that kind of laugh is the one people use when they're trying to get out of an uncomfortable situation. They all agreed to just toss the sandwich away and call it a night. So they threw it in the trash, locked up their lockers, and left the bunk to head to the parade square for last roll call, as we did every night. But there was this weird feeling in the air. It wasn't just the tiredness or the anger from the PT. It felt like something wasn't right, like there was an invisible thread pulling at everyone's attention. Everyone's trying to brush it off, but the unease lingered. We stood at attention for the last parade, eyes forward, minds all over the place. But we didn't talk about the sandwich anymore. It was dismissed, forgotten. At least, that's what we all tried to tell ourselves. But when we returned to the bunk after the parade, things got even stranger. Jackson, who'd made the joke about the ghost and the sandwich, was the first to go to his locker. We all just followed him, still feeling that weird tension. It was like there was a sort of unspoken competition to see who could act the most normal, the most unaffected by what had happened earlier. Jackson didn't even hesitate as he walked over to his locker. He turned the lock and swung the door open. And there it was, the sandwich, right there. sitting in the exact same spot where it had been when the officer found it earlier. Nobody said a word at first. We all just stood there, staring at it. It was almost like a trick of the mind, like we were all seeing things or having some kind of collective hallucination. But there it was, unmistakable. A damn sandwich. I don't know how to explain it, but I know for sure that nobody put it there. None of us did. None of us had any idea how it got there, and to be honest, no one wanted to find out. The room was still for a long time. Not one of us moved. It wasn't until someone, maybe it was Jackson, maybe it was someone else, finally said, "This is messed up," that anyone moved at all. That's when the officer came in. He didn't say anything at first either. He just looked at the sandwich, then at us, and then back at the sandwich. He asked us if we'd had a prank going, if someone had been messing with him. But we all swore up and down that we hadn't touched the thing. The whole bunk was silent. Nobody made eye contact. It was like time had stopped, and no one knew what to do. After a few minutes, the officer just told us to leave it. He wasn't going to punish anyone else for it, and honestly, I think he was more confused than anything. But I wasn't the same after that. None of us were. Every night, when we locked our lockers, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just off. I would look at the locker, knowing that something had been there, and I couldn't figure out how or why. We never spoke of the sandwich again. There were no ghost stories, no elaborate explanations. The officer never mentioned it either. It was as though we'd all agreed it didn't happen, that it was a fluke or something to be forgotten. But I'll never forget it. Maybe it was one of the guys pulling some prank, but I don't think it was. There was something about it, something that didn't add up. To this day, I don't know what happened with that sandwich. But every time I lock a locker, I think about it. And I still don't know if it was a ghost or just a strange, stupid coincidence. It was the summer of 2001. I was 8 years old, and we were headed out to buy a car. My dad had found a used car on an online listing in a neighboring state, and we were excited because it was affordable, reliable, and looked just right. We were driving down a long, 4-lane highway that cut through the flat countryside. 2 lanes on either side, with a grass-filled median dividing the 2 directions of traffic. It was late in the afternoon, the sun was low, and we had been on the road for hours, the hum of the tires on the asphalt blending with the radio playing softly in the background. The trip there had been uneventful. We arrived, looked at the car, and felt like we'd hit a bit of luck. The car ran well, everything checked out, and the deal was struck. We loaded up and began the long drive back home, chatting casually, the kind of conversation that keeps you occupied during a road trip. But that drive home was far more eventful than I could have ever imagined. I remember the weather, how it seemed to get grayer and cooler as we moved along, like the atmosphere itself was bracing for something. I sat in the back seat, eyes half on the road, half on the toys or books I'd brought along for the trip. My dad was in the front, keeping his usual eye on the road, and my mom sat beside him, focused on the passing scenery. Then it happened. It was so sudden and surreal, I couldn't process it at first. It felt like a blur, something that happened too quickly to even register. A small red car, a 2-door sedan, was coming from the opposite direction. I saw it briefly, moving along at a regular speed. Then, all of a sudden, the car swerved, veered into the grassy median, and started to spin. I didn't understand what was happening. The car was spinning in a sickening, out-of-control spiral, and I could feel the weight of my own pulse quicken as my eyes locked onto it. The vehicle was airborne for a moment, its tires leaving the ground, flipping and tumbling toward us. It happened in what felt like an instant, but it was so violent, so chaotic, I couldn't tear my gaze away from it. The car landed with a sickening crunch on the road ahead of us, the sound of metal and plastic crumpling under pressure. And then the worst part. The driver of the red car, he was thrown through the side window, the glass shattering as he was flung into the road. I could see him clearly now, his body twisted unnaturally, crumpled in a way that no person should ever be. He was lying there, motionless at first, then slowly twitching. His arm reached out, and I could hear this low, guttural sound, a groaning, horrible noise, like he was trying to speak, but it came out strangled, broken. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and burning rubber, and there was something else, something strange out of place. I could see the red car, now completely stopped in the ditch off to the side, steam rising from under its crumpled hood, a Domino's pizza delivery bag hanging half out of the back. The pizza box had flipped open, with a few slices spilling out onto the dirt and grass, untouched, left behind by the chaos. I remember staring at that pizza. It didn't make sense. The smell of it hit me in the strange quiet that followed the crash. The rain had started, a light drizzle that didn't do much to clear the air, and I could almost taste the scent of fresh pizza and gasoline. The juxtaposition of the mundane and the horrific was something I'd never forget. I turned away, but my mind wouldn't let go of the image. It kept playing back over and over again, the spinning car, the thud of it hitting the road, the helplessness of the man lying there, writhing in pain. My dad stopped the car, pulling over to the shoulder. Others did the same. People came running, some with cell phones already pressed to their ears, trying to get through to emergency services. I could hear the far-off sound of sirens, but it felt like it was so far away. My dad told me we should move away, that we needed to let the authorities handle it, but my feet wouldn't move. I was stuck, frozen in place by the reality of what I had just seen. My curiosity pulled me towards the wrecked car, though my mind screamed at me to look away. I wanted to understand, to make sense of the situation, to see it for myself. My feet carried me toward the car with no real purpose. As we walked closer, I couldn't help but look back at the man, still groaning, blood pooling in the road around him. I could see his face now, bruised and battered, his eyes fluttering in and out of consciousness. I thought I could hear him saying something, but I couldn't make it out. His voice was a rasp, a desperate plea for help that no one could answer in time. My dad was a few steps ahead, his face pale and tense. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was just as disturbed by what had happened. We reached the car, and it was just as I'd seen it from afar, a crumpled mess of metal, steam rising from the wrecked engine. The pizza box, still partially open, flapped in the wind, its contents forgotten and trampled by the chaos. I couldn't take my eyes off the pizza. I wasn't hungry, I didn't even want to think about food, but that box, the pizza, it was like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. A man's life had been torn apart, and yet here was this ordinary object, completely unaffected by the horror that had unfolded. It was a bizarre and disturbing moment, one that left me feeling empty and disconnected from everything. As I looked at the wreckage, I could hear more sirens in the distance. The ambulance would be there soon, but I knew deep down it wouldn't be enough. I couldn't shake the thought that the man would not survive this. There were too many signs that told me it was over. The way his body was sprawled across the road, the way his movements were slowing, the desperate rasp of his breathing. It wasn't long before a paramedic arrived and began to assess the situation. The other bystanders had begun to disperse, some murmuring about what had happened, others retreating into their own thoughts, trying to distance themselves from the gruesome reality. But I couldn't pull myself away. I could still hear the man's groans as the paramedics worked on him, as they tried to stabilize him and get him into the ambulance. But it didn't feel real. The sound of the ambulance doors closing, the sound of the sirens fading into the distance, it all seemed so distant, so disconnected from everything else. I could still smell the gasoline, the damp earth, the rain, and yes, the pizza. We left after that. My dad insisted we get back in the car and continue our journey, but I couldn't shake the images from my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, about his groans, about the things I had seen and smelled, about the randomness of it all. I thought about how fragile life is, how we go about our daily routines without thinking of how quickly it could all be over. One moment you're driving, doing your job, delivering pizzas, and the next, you're a crumpled heap in the road, with strangers standing over you, unable to help. I thought about that pizza box, still open in the wind, and it struck me how something so small, so ordinary, could be a reminder of life's fragility. I couldn't stop thinking about it, even as we made our way home. The man died later that night at the hospital, or so I was told. I didn't want to know the details. All I could think of was the way his body had looked in the road, the way he had groaned, asking for help that never came. And the pizza. I couldn't get that damn pizza out of my head. If only he had worn his seatbelt. If only he had gotten some sleep the night before. If only he hadn't been so exhausted behind the wheel. There were so many things that could have prevented it. So many small decisions that, if made differently, might have saved his life. But it didn't work that way. Life doesn't give you second chances. It just happens. I never really understood what my dad was trying to tell me about how accidents can happen in the blink of an eye. That moment, though, that one terrible, horrifying moment, drilled it into me in a way no words ever could. Life is fragile. It can change in an instant, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. You can't prepare for it. You can't predict it. All you can do is keep going and hope that your moment doesn't come too soon. I had just moved into my first apartment alone about 2 weeks before it all happened. It was a basement unit at the edge of a small complex on the older side of town. Cheap, like suspiciously cheap, but I didn't care. I was broke, fresh out of college, starting my first full-time job, and trying to prove to myself that I could do everything on my own. Rent was low, the place was mostly quiet, and I liked the feeling of independence. I thought I'd scored a great deal. The apartment was small but decent. It had a long hallway that opened into the kitchen and living room area, with 2 bedrooms on opposite sides. I used one bedroom as my own, obviously. The other was empty, just a few boxes I hadn't unpacked, yet stacked against the wall. It was supposed to be for guests or maybe an office someday, but I hadn't gotten that far. Still, it was nice having the space, even if I didn't use it. Being a basement unit meant the windows were right at ground level, which I hadn't really considered when I signed the lease. If you looked out, you'd see the lawn or the concrete walkways around the building, and when people walked by, you'd just see their legs and shoes. That was fine during the day. At night, though, it made me uneasy. There were no bars on the windows, and even though the neighborhood was supposed to be safe enough, something about sleeping just a few feet from ground level felt vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt before. My bedroom window faced the back of the complex where people rarely walked, so I always kept the blinds closed. But in the other bedroom, there was some water damage around the window frame. The previous tenant had apparently left the blinds down and shut for too long after a rainstorm, so moisture had gotten trapped between the frame and the wall. The landlord asked me to keep the blinds up to let air and light get in until maintenance could fix it. I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't my room. I just made sure the window stayed open during the day and closed it at night, but I never put the blinds down. The first couple weeks were uneventful. I was getting used to the quiet hum of the refrigerator at night and the occasional creak from the pipes. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps above me, just the upstairs neighbor walking around, or the sound of someone's dog barking through the thin walls. Nothing strange. I kept busy, mostly coming home late after work, eating something simple, maybe watching some shows in bed, and crashing. It felt good to have my own place. I didn't feel lonely yet. I liked the silence. I liked the idea that I had no one to answer to. But then came that night. I woke up like I'd been pulled out of sleep by a string. Not groggy, not confused, just instantly wide awake. I didn't hear anything. There was no sound, no movement. But something felt off. It wasn't like waking up to pee or because of a dream. It was the kind of wake up where every nerve in your body seems to be listening for something. I was lying on my side, facing the wall, wrapped up in a blanket, still as stone. I slowly reached for my phone on the nightstand and saw the time. It was just past 4 a.m. I held my breath for a moment, trying to decide if I'd imagined the feeling. Then, slowly, I turned over and looked toward the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a shadow on the blinds. A huge, human-shaped shadow. Someone was standing right at my window, and they had a flashlight. I could see the light flicker through the slats, moving back and forth like they were scanning the inside of my room, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't move much, just stood there, close, quiet, heavy. The flashlight beam moved slowly, methodically, like they were looking for something specific. I froze. My stomach dropped, and I felt my limbs go numb. It was like my whole body was trying to figure out whether to panic or stay absolutely still. I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe loudly. Just lay there, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I slowly reached under my bed, where I kept a small hunting knife. It was nothing fancy, just something I'd taken on camping trips a few times, but it was sharp, solid, and in that moment, it felt like the only thing between me and disaster. I gripped it tightly and slid out of bed without making a sound. The floors were old, and I knew where the creaky boards were. I avoided them like I'd practiced it 100 times. I moved to the hallway and stood in the dark for a moment, knife in one hand, phone in the other. The hallway gave me a clear line of sight into the second bedroom, the one with the wide open window. I peeked around the corner and saw the flashlight beam again. This time it was inside the other room. The person had moved. They were standing outside the empty room now, scanning the floor with that same slow, careful motion. I could only see part of their body through the window. The rest was blocked by the wall. But I saw enough. They were big, broad shoulders, heavy boots. Their keys jingled faintly with each step. I could just make out the silhouette of their hand, holding the flashlight. They weren't in any kind of uniform, at least not one I recognized. They looked like a construction worker or something. Someone strong, someone who belonged outdoors in boots and thick clothes. Not outside my apartment window at 4 a.m. At that point, I was shaking. My whole body was hot and cold at the same time. I pressed my back against the hallway wall and tried to keep my breath steady. Every scenario ran through my head. This was a burglar, someone casing the place before breaking in, or worse, someone who had seen me through the window earlier and was now back for something else. That's when my phone buzzed. The vibration nearly made me drop it. I looked down and saw a text from my friend. He worked for the local police department. He'd been a classmate in high school, and we'd kept in touch since moving back to town. All the text said was, "What's going on at your apartment?" My heart almost stopped. That couldn't be a coincidence. I hadn't called anyone. No alarms had gone off. There was no way anyone knew what was happening. I typed back as fast as I could, fingers fumbling. "There's someone outside, looking in my windows." I stared at the screen, waiting for a reply, but nothing came. I crept back into my bedroom and sat on the bed, still gripping the knife. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't know if the person was still outside or had moved on. I sat there, listening to the hum of the fridge, the faint clicking of the heating pipes, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. A few minutes passed. It felt like hours. Then came a knock on the door. Not just a knock, pounding. Heavy, forceful banging, like someone trying to break it down. My stomach dropped again. I held the knife tighter and walked to the door. I didn't have a peephole. No chain lock. Just a deadbolt and a handle. I stood with my ear close to the wood, trying to hear anything, footsteps, breathing, movement. Then a voice came, muffled but clear. A man's voice saying something. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't answer. My first thought was that whoever had been outside was now pretending to be the police, trying to trick me into opening the door. I stayed silent. Then the voice came again, louder this time, saying I wasn't in trouble. Still, I didn't trust it. I didn't move. After a few more seconds, I decided to crack the door open just a little. The knife was in my right hand, hidden behind the door. My left hand turned the lock and pulled it open just enough to peek out. There were two cops, real ones. One was standing back, hands visible, calm. The other was further up the steps leading to the sidewalk. Both were looking at me with serious expressions. I must have looked insane, eyes wide, face pale, probably still trembling. I'm sure they saw the knife. I didn't say anything right away, and neither did they. Just silence and tension. Finally, one of them gestured that everything was okay. I stepped back and opened the door wider, and they came in carefully, explaining that they had been the ones outside my window, that they were responding to a report. I didn't say much. I just stood there, breathing hard, trying to understand what was going on. Eventually they left. I locked the door again, checked all the windows, closed the blinds in the second bedroom, and sat on the floor. I didn't go back to sleep that night. I didn't move for hours. The adrenaline slowly drained out of me, and I just sat there in silence. At some point, the sun came up. The apartment started to feel like a normal place again, but I didn't. Later that day, I heard from my friend. He told me the whole story. Apparently, someone in another unit had come home drunk, lost his keys, and broken into his own apartment through the window. The noise and confusion led someone to call the cops, who then thought the break-in was at my unit. They saw the open window, the boxes, and assumed that's where the trouble was. That's why they were looking in. That's why they knocked. It all made sense in hindsight, but in the moment, it was the most terrifying night of my life. I'd gone from peaceful sleep to full-blown panic in seconds. I'd stood in my hallway in the dark, holding a knife, thinking I might have to fight for my life. And all of it was just a misunderstanding. After that, I never left the blinds up again. I bought a curtain rod and blackout curtains for the second bedroom and installed them myself. I added a cheap door camera, even if it was mostly for peace of mind. I kept the knife closer. I never felt quite the same about that apartment after. I stayed there for a few more months until my lease was up, and then I moved. I told myself it was because of better lighting, cheaper utilities, or shorter commute, but deep down I knew the truth. It was because of that night. Because once you feel that kind of fear in a place, it never really goes away. Even when the sun's out, Even when the windows are shut, even when it was all just a mistake, you remember how it felt. You remember how it could have gone differently. And you don't forget. I woke up one day to an eerie silence in the house. I was young, younger than 10, but old enough to recognize that something wasn't right. Normally, mornings in our house were full of noise. My mom worked nights, but she was always there when I woke up, taking naps or having her morning coffee before she went to bed. My brothers were usually still asleep, sprawled out on the couch or in their rooms, lost in their dreams until at least noon. My dad would be the only one missing, off at work like he always was. But this day was different. There was no one. The house was empty, and not in the way it was when my parents went out. It was an unsettling kind of silence, the kind you feel in your bones. I could hear the occasional creak of the house settling, but that was it. I called out for my mom, thinking maybe she'd just gone out for a walk or to run errands, but there was no answer. Her bedroom door was open, but the bed was untouched. I called for my brothers next, but neither of them were up yet. Lucas, the older one, usually slept like a rock, but it was so quiet, so unnervingly quiet, that I began to feel a creeping sense of unease. I tried to push it aside, figuring I was just being overdramatic. But the silence didn't sit well with me. I turned on the TV, hoping some noise would fill the empty space, but even with the volume cranked up, it felt like the house was absorbing the sound. It was as if everything was muffled, even the music. The air in the house felt thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My stomach churned, and I felt sick. I tried calling my mom's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The same thing happened when I called my dad, and Lucas and Rory, my younger brother, didn't answer their phones either. It was around that time that I first heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound, almost like someone whistling, coming from downstairs. It was the kind of whistling you might hear in a movie, the kind that made your skin crawl. I froze. It wasn't just the whistling itself, it was the timing. No one was supposed to be here, and no one would be whistling in my house. My heart raced. The whistling grew louder and more distinct, like it was getting closer, echoing through the empty halls. I knew I had to do something, but I was frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't bring myself to go downstairs and check it out. The idea of walking into that silence, of confronting whatever was making that sound, terrified me. I dialed my parents' numbers over and over, but each time, it was the same. Straight to voicemail. The whistling stopped abruptly. Then came the laughter. It was faint at first, like it came from a toy. I didn't recognize the sound. It wasn't a toy I owned, nor was it anything familiar from the house. It was strange, distant, yet unnervingly close. It didn't belong in my house. Then, just as suddenly as the laughter started, it stopped, and the whistling began again. At this point, my nerves were shot. My breathing quickened, and I felt lightheaded. My chest tightened with panic. I had to get out of there. I needed to leave the house, but the idea of stepping into the world outside felt just as daunting. I lived across the street from a small strip mall with a bar, a bakery, and a Shell station, so I knew I could go there. It was a short walk, but I wasn't sure I could make it alone. I was just a kid, and everything about that day felt off, like I was stuck in some weird dream where nothing made sense. I stood at the door for what felt like an eternity, my hand on the handle. But just as I was about to leave, I heard the door behind me creak open. My brother Lucas stepped out, blinking at the bright light in the hallway. He looked at me, confused. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. I was so sure I was alone. My heart skipped a beat. How could he be here? I thought I had been in the house alone. My stomach twisted again, the unease crawling back up my spine. Lucas seemed just as confused as I was. He didn't remember hearing the whistling or the laughter. He had been asleep too, just like I thought. We didn't say much to each other. We just left. We decided to go to the Shell station, maybe see someone, anyone. I didn't want to be alone in the house anymore. When we stepped outside, I was surprised to see Rory walking down the street toward us. He lived a few blocks away, so the coincidence seemed a bit too much. But he had the same look on his face, like something was wrong. When I asked him, he told us he had heard the whistling too. He said he thought it had come from the street, but he wasn't sure. All three of us stood there, looking at each other, trying to make sense of it all. We walked together to the strip mall. The usual buzz of activity was missing. The person behind the counter at Shell was clearly on edge, glancing nervously at the door whenever it opened. The bakers at the bakery, who were usually cheerful and chatty, barely acknowledged us. It was like they were there, but not really there, like their minds were elsewhere. They didn't even greet us. Rory went into the bar to grab a soda, and when he came back, he looked more unsettled than before. He said the staff there seemed off too, like they weren't acting like themselves. We all stood in the street for a while, not saying much, just trying to process what was happening. It didn't make sense. It was like we had stepped into a parallel world where everything was slightly wrong, and no one was acknowledging it. The people who knew us, who had known us for years, were acting strange. They didn't smile at us, didn't make eye contact. It was like they were strangers, but we couldn't put our finger on it. We didn't know what to do, so we walked to our school playground and just sat there until it got dark. At least it felt normal there. No one was acting strange, and the air felt a little less heavy. We talked a little, but none of us had any answers. By the time we returned home, everything felt different. The silence was gone, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The house no longer felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. My parents didn't ask where I'd been. They didn't question us at all. It was as if nothing had happened, as if we had just spent the day playing in the yard. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something none of us could explain. The next day, I decided to investigate. I went into the basement, trying to track down the sound I had heard. The house felt normal again, but my curiosity got the better of me. I wandered through the dark basement, moving between boxes and old furniture, until something caught my eye. A stuffed bear. It wasn't mine. It was one of those old bears with a music box inside, the kind that plays a lullaby when you wind it up. But this one wasn't in my room. I didn't know where it had come from, and I couldn't understand why it would be down there. The music box wasn't playing, but I still felt a chill run through me. It hadn't been there before. I couldn't be sure, but I was certain it wasn't a toy I owned. I didn't need it around anymore, so I took it upstairs and left it on the front porch. The bear didn't stay in my house after that. The days that followed felt normal, but there was still something unsettled in my mind. Lucas insisted it was a prank. He said we had all been in on it, that it was meant to scare me. But I knew better. There was no way he had gotten the entire neighborhood to stop everything they were doing for the day. My dad would never ignore 20 missed calls. Rory didn't talk about it, but he avoided it whenever I brought it up. He just said he'd rather not talk about it. I still don't know what happened that day. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Or maybe it was something else, something I couldn't understand at that age. I'll never know for sure. But the whistling, the laughter, and the strange behavior of the people I knew still make my skin crawl. And that bear, it's long gone now, but I still remember the way it looked, sitting there in the basement. Every time I think about that day, I can hear the faint whistle in the distance, like it's just waiting to be heard again. I grew up in a house that had a history I never quite understood, but always felt. It wasn't much to look at, just a square structure with white peeling paint, the sort of house that doesn't catch your eye unless you're really looking. But that was the thing. The house had been a schoolhouse, a one-room schoolhouse, tucked on the side of a hill. My great-aunt's husband's family had owned the whole hillside, massive fields of corn and grain stretching out across the land. The house had once been used to store grain, then transformed into a schoolhouse. It showed up on a map from 1844, and that was as far back as I could track it. I lived there with my mom and, when I was younger, my little brother. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I think it was the kind of place that people forget or only remember in passing, an old relic from another time that no one really talked about much, but was there, sitting on the hill like a silent witness to whatever came before it. The story I knew about the place was this. When it had been a schoolhouse, a boy had tried to break in one night. He was probably part of a dare, a bet with his friends. They said he was a tough kid, or at least he wanted to be, so he decided to prove it by sneaking into the old school. He pried open a window, one of those old-fashioned wooden ones that opened with a sharp creak, and somehow it came crashing down on his neck. It killed him instantly. His friends ran off, terrified, but the boy never got up. His neck had snapped so violently that no one could have helped him. I don't know if it was the sort of thing that made people afraid, but it always hung there, like a shadow in the back of my mind. I guess it made the house feel even older, even emptier. Sometimes I would go to bed at night and think about it, about the boy and the terrible accident that had happened there so long ago. I never heard anything, but I couldn't shake the thought of it, as if the house itself remembered. When I was 17, I had a birthday party. Just a small group of girls, 5 or 6 of us. And we spent the evening doing what teenage girls do, talking, laughing, and staying up way too late. We decided to break out the Ouija board. I don't know why. Maybe we were curious, or maybe it was just the thing to do. At the time, I thought it was all a joke, just some silly game to pass the time. But when we started using it, it felt different. I can still remember the way the planchette moved, slowly at first, but then faster and faster, as if it were being pulled by something far stronger than any of us. We started getting a barrage of messages. I remember us scrambling to write it all down because we couldn't keep up. The board was spelling out a story, one that didn't make sense at first, but then it clicked. The board told us about a 12-year-old boy who had died in the schoolhouse. And then, almost as an afterthought, it said something that made my heart race. It said, "The boy has always watched out for you. Your smile reminds him of his sister, Gertie's smile." I remember the chill that ran down my spine. Gertie. That was the name of the boy's sister. I'd never told anyone that name before. How did the board know that? I thought maybe it was just coincidence, but the more I thought about it, the more the details piled up. And then it told me something else. It asked me to go into the library. The library wasn't really a library. It was a small walk-in closet in our house, crammed with books, old books, books that had been there as long as I could remember. The board told me to open the window. I don't know why, but as soon as it said that, something in me froze. I didn't want to go to that closet. I didn't know why, but it felt like I shouldn't. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and my hands were shaking. I tried to brush it off, but the pressure was there, in the air, thick and heavy. It was like something was urging me, but at the same time warning me. I got up from the table, my legs feeling like lead as I walked toward the closet. But as soon as I stepped into the room, I couldn't do it. My breath caught in my throat. The air felt too cold, too still, like I was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. I looked at the window. The old wooden frame looked even older in the dark, the paint chipped and peeling. My fingers reached for the latch, but I couldn't touch it. Something held me back, and I don't know why. The fear was too much. I turned around and ran out of the room, back to the safety of the others, but the unease didn't leave. It stayed with me, hanging like a cloud over the rest of the night. I didn't say anything to the girls. I didn't want to seem foolish, but I could still feel the pull of the library, the pull of the boy's presence. It was like I had crossed a line, but I didn't understand what line it was. After the party, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about the boy and his sister, Gertie. I had to know more. I decided to do a little research for a school project. I thought it would be a good idea to dig into the history of the house, maybe find out more about the accident and the boy's life. I went to the local library, digging through old records and maps. That's when I found out that the boy had died at the age of 12. His name was Henry, and he had been a student at the schoolhouse. His sister's name was Gertrude, Gertie, like the board had said. I don't know why, but it felt like a confirmation, like something was tying the whole thing together. But there was more. The more I looked into it, the more I realized that Henry had died in the exact spot where my house now stood. The same window he had tried to climb through had been where the grain storage had once been. That was the window, the one I had been too scared to open. I went back to the house after that, feeling the weight of it all. I stood in the library again, staring at the window. I kept thinking about the boy, about what he'd said, about how he'd always watched out for me. It sounded so strange. The boy had watched out for me? The boy who had died in that schoolhouse so many years ago? I didn't understand it. My mom had never been there for me. She was always drunk, always distant, and her boyfriend. Well, I don't even want to get into it. It wasn't the kind of thing that made you feel protected. So how could this boy have been watching out for me? How could he have cared? I stood there in the silence of the library, staring at the window. I couldn't bring myself to open it. It felt wrong, like the moment had passed, like there was nothing left to do but acknowledge the past and move on. But I felt a pang of guilt, a strange ache in my chest. I apologized to Henry, even though I didn't believe in ghosts, even though I wasn't sure if he was real. I couldn't help it. Something about it felt like I needed to make it right, even if only in my own mind. I've lived in that house for most of my life now, and every time I grab a book off the shelf in the library, I think of him. I still apologize, even though I'm not sure I believe in any of it. I'm not sure what happened that night with the Ouija board, or what really happened to Henry, but sometimes I think about it, especially when I'm alone in that house, standing in the library with the window that I never opened. And sometimes I wonder, if I had opened that window, would things have been different? Would it have changed anything? Would Henry have been able to help me, to protect me, like he said he would? Or maybe it wouldn't have mattered at all. Maybe some things are just too much to change. I'll never really know, but I'll always apologize just in case. I had a lot of time on my hands when I was a kid. My mom worked day shifts, and my dad worked nights. That meant I had to entertain myself for hours, usually while they were away. I was pretty young, maybe 5 or 6, and for the most part, I didn't mind being alone. I never thought much about it. It was my normal. I'd have the house to myself, and that was fine. My dad would sleep in the bedroom while my mom worked, and I'd get the entire house to roam around in. I'd sometimes play with toys or watch TV, but that often got boring after a while. When boredom set in, I would head to my room and pick up the home phone. At the time, it wasn't something strange for me. I didn't know that you weren't supposed to call random numbers on the landline. I just pressed buttons, curious about what would happen. Sometimes it would just ring, and no one would pick up, but sometimes someone would answer. I never really cared if it was a mistake, because it was fun for me. After all, what else was there to do? I'd pick up the phone, press the buttons, and just wait for someone to answer. I remember the sound of the dial tone as I hit the numbers, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed in the quiet house. I would giggle when someone would pick up, mostly because I had no idea who it was. Sometimes, people would get annoyed and tell me not to call strangers. They'd say things like, "Hey little one, don't do that. Don't talk to strangers." But they never seemed to sound too angry, just tired or annoyed, as if they were used to getting prank calls. I didn't understand the warning at the time. I was just having fun. Then one afternoon, something different happened. I was home alone again. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were the only one alive. I sat in the living room, flipping through TV channels, bored. The clock on the wall ticked away. After a while, I got up, walked over to the phone, and picked it up. I dialed a random number. I don't know why I did it, but I was curious to see who would pick up that time. I pressed the buttons, listening to the dialing tones as I waited. Then suddenly someone picked up. "Hello." The voice on the other end was deep and slow, as though they weren't in a hurry to talk. I paused, unsure of what to say. "Hello, who is this?" I asked. There was a moment of silence, and then the man's voice came again. "Ho ho ho, is this my name?" I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded like Santa Claus, and I couldn't believe it. My mind raced with excitement. Of course, I didn't know what was going on, but I was young, so I believed in Santa. In fact, I was so excited that I could barely form a sentence. "Santa?" I asked, barely able to believe it. "Yes, it's Santa. I've been keeping an eye on you," the man said. His voice was warm and friendly, like something out of a Christmas movie. I could barely contain my excitement. I wanted to ask him everything. My mind was racing with questions. Do you really have reindeer? How do you fly all around the world in one night? Do you live at the North Pole? I asked. I could barely get the words out fast enough, so eager to learn everything I could. I could hear the man chuckling on the other end of the phone. He answered some of my questions with patience, almost like a storyteller. I could feel myself getting lost in his voice, in the warmth of it. This wasn't like those other calls. This felt real. For the first time, I really thought I was talking to Santa. Then, something strange happened. The man's tone shifted, and I noticed the change immediately. He went from being friendly and fun to something a little darker. "So, I've been thinking," he said, his voice a little more serious. "It looks like one of my elves has misplaced your address. You know, I've been trying to get it right, but we can't deliver presents to you without it." I felt a jolt of fear in my stomach. I had no idea what to make of it. I thought about the presents I was hoping for, new toys, maybe even something special, and the idea that I might not get them because Santa couldn't find me made me panic. I didn't know my address at that age. I barely knew where I lived. All I could remember was my street name, but that wasn't enough. I couldn't remember the rest of it. "Santa, I don't know my address," I said, almost on the verge of tears. "Well, you better find it," the man said, his voice becoming even more insistent. "If you don't tell me where you live, you won't get any presents this year. We can't deliver them without your address. I need to know where to send them." I was scared now. The excitement from before turned into dread. I couldn't understand why this Santa, this man I thought I could trust, was telling me I wouldn't get anything unless I gave him my address. I remember my heart racing as I tried to remember where I lived. I could picture the street, but I couldn't remember the house number. I began crying, panic taking over me. I ran to my parents' bedroom, holding the phone in my shaking hands. I screamed, "Santa needs our address. Santa needs our address." I was crying, so confused, so terrified that Christmas would be ruined. My dad, who had been sleeping, jumped out of bed, startled by my screaming. He looked furious as he grabbed the phone out of my hands. "What is this?" he barked, his voice full of irritation. But before he could say more, the line went dead. The man, the supposed Santa, had hung up. My dad stared at the phone, then at me, his face turning from anger to concern. He asked what had happened, and I told him everything. How Santa had called, how he needed my address, how I couldn't remember it. My dad's expression changed, but he didn't say much more. I could tell he didn't think much of it, but I could see something in his eyes, a glint of suspicion. After that day, my parents made sure I never touched the phone again. They never told me exactly why, but they didn't have to. I could tell they didn't trust it, and I didn't either. I didn't even understand how someone had gotten my number, or why they'd acted like Santa. I didn't know how I had ended up talking to a stranger. I just knew that something wasn't right. I stayed quiet about the whole thing. I didn't talk to my friends about it, and I didn't bring it up again with my parents. But it stayed with me. The idea that someone had used the guise of Santa to scare me, to manipulate me, left me feeling uneasy for years. Every time I thought about it, I could still hear that man's voice on the other end of the phone, how it had started so warm and friendly, and then how it had changed, getting colder and more insistent as he pressured me. As I grew older, I began to understand what had happened. Someone had been messing with me, playing a sick game. I didn't know why they'd do it. Maybe they thought it was funny, or maybe they had some other twisted reason for calling a little kid. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that what had happened wasn't something innocent. I never forgot that feeling of helplessness, of not knowing my own address, and being tricked into thinking I wouldn't get anything for Christmas. The trust one had in the holiday, in Santa, was shattered by that phone call. And while I eventually grew out of believing in Santa, I never grew out of that fear. That feeling that someone could be on the other side of the line, pretending to be someone they weren't, still creeps me out to this day. I'll never know who that man was, or why he did what he did, but I can't shake the feeling that it was no accident. There was something deliberate, something sinister, in that call. And as much as I try to put it behind me, it's one of those things I'll never forget. I learned a lot that day, not just about being careful with phones and strangers, but about how quickly something innocent can turn into something dark. I was alone at the house that day, like I was most afternoons. It was a quiet, ordinary kind of day, just like any other, out on the high plains in the small town where we lived. The town wasn't huge, still had a couple thousand people, but it felt much quieter, especially where I lived. Our place sat right in the middle of town, which you wouldn't think would be a problem, but sometimes it made me feel like I was exposed, like anything could happen in the middle of all this quiet. Our house was a little old, but cozy. The front porch had a screen door that didn't lock, something I meant to fix for months, but never got around to. The big wooden door would sometimes catch, but it had a tendency to swing open if you weren't careful. It wasn't ideal, especially with our dog, Lucy. She was this little terrier mix, a ball of energy, and one of the most stubborn creatures I'd ever met. And she had one arch nemesis, the squirrel that lived in the tree in the corner of our yard. If Lucy saw that squirrel, she'd lose her mind. She'd chase it all over the yard, barking like a crazy dog. And if the door was even slightly open, she'd bolt right through it. That day, I was sitting inside when I heard the familiar, frantic sound of her barking. My heart sank a little, knowing exactly what was going on. I got up and walked over to the door, ready to stop her before she got herself into trouble. When I opened the door, I was greeted by the usual chaos. There was Lucy, barking like crazy at the base of the tree, just like always. But something was different this time. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Instead of the usual squirrel, there was something much larger. A bear. A black bear. It was sitting in the tree, not very high up, maybe 15 feet at most, but enough to make me freeze in place. I stood there for a moment, shocked. Bears weren't something you expected to see in town. We lived in a small community, but we weren't exactly in the middle of nowhere. There were houses all around, and the streets weren't far off. I wasn't even sure how the bear had gotten there, but it didn't matter. It was there, and Lucy was losing her mind, oblivious to the danger. She kept barking at the bear, not even remotely understanding that she was about to face something way out of her league. I could feel my pulse quicken. I didn't want to make any sudden movements, didn't want to startle the bear or make it feel threatened. I had to get Lucy back inside before she got herself into serious trouble. Slowly, I crept forward, trying to keep as quiet as possible. The bear wasn't moving, just sitting in the tree, looking down at Lucy, probably as surprised as I was to be this close to a human and a dog. I had just reached out to grab Lucy's collar when everything went south. Without warning, the bear freaked out. It suddenly scrambled, its claws scraping against the bark, and then it leapt, straight down, right at me. My heart stopped. I barely had time to react, but I could feel the bear's fur as it almost landed right on top of me, its massive form crashing down through the air. I stumbled backward, my brain struggling to process what was happening. I could hear the heavy thud of its paws hitting the ground as it bounded away from me, clearly just as freaked out as I was. For a split second, everything was a blur of motion. My heart was racing, and I was barely processing that I just narrowly avoided being crushed by a bear. But then I heard it, Lucy. She was barking her head off, chasing after the bear, still convinced she was going to chase it out of our yard. The bear wasn't fighting back, just running, clearly scared, and it wasn't trying to hurt Lucy. It was just trying to get away. I watched in horror as the bear ran into the backyard, Lucy hot on its heels. Our backyard wasn't fully fenced in at that point, but it was almost there, about 90% finished. The only part of the yard that wasn't enclosed was a small gap in the fence, a hole that we planned to fill that afternoon. I stood there, frozen for a second, my stomach dropping into my shoes. The bear was stuck. It was running in circles, trying to find a way out, but it couldn't. The fence was keeping it trapped, and Lucy was still barking like she had the upper hand. I was terrified. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through me as I watched the bear panic. I didn't know much about bears, but I knew that when an animal feels cornered, it can get dangerous. And I had no idea how Lucy would react if the bear decided to defend itself. I could already see the massive paws, the sharp claws, and I had no desire to watch one of those things come down on my dog. Or on me. I didn't think, I just reacted. I started yelling for Lucy to stop, but she wasn't listening. She was too fixated on the bear, too sure of herself. I ran after her, trying to get between them before things got even worse. I could hear the bear still crashing around, its heavy body slamming into the fence as it tried to find a way out. I couldn't let Lucy get any closer. I had to get her away from the bear before it turned on her. The whole scene felt like it was happening in slow motion, like every second was stretching out forever. I chased Lucy through the yard, my heart racing, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I desperately tried to corral my dog away from the bear. The bear was still running, its huge body zigzagging through the yard, looking for any possible escape. But it was trapped. It was only a matter of time before it started to feel cornered. Lucy was still barking, still chasing. She wasn't backing down, not even a little. I could see her darting in and out, trying to get closer, trying to chase the bear out of our yard like she was some kind of hero. I couldn't believe how brave, or maybe how stupid, she was being. I yelled again, trying to get her attention, but she was too caught up in her mission. I finally got close enough to grab her collar. I pulled her back with all my strength, yanking her away from the bear, who was still trying to figure out a way to escape. It was like pulling a dog away from a tug-of-war rope, but with the added fear of a bear being just a few feet away. I was panting, trying to control Lucy, who was still pulling against me, eager to finish what she'd started. The bear was pacing in circles now, looking for the hole in the fence. And then, just as I was starting to lose hope, I saw it. The gap, the opening in the fence. The bear had found it. It turned and bolted toward it, Lucy still barking and running after it, not realizing that the bear was getting away. I couldn't stop her now. She was too far gone. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, watching the scene unfold. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the bear darted through the gap in the fence. Lucy stopped barking, her tail wagging in the air, like she'd just won some kind of victory. I was panting, sweat pouring down my face, completely exhausted. The bear didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running. I watched it disappear into the trees behind the house, its massive frame slipping into the woods. My heart was still pounding in my chest as I stood there, trying to catch my breath. It took me a second to realize what was going on around me. I looked up, and there were trucks lined up along the road, neighbors standing on their porches, all staring at me. I hadn't even noticed the commotion, too wrapped up in the chaos of the bear and Lucy. They were all watching me, watching the bear run off, probably thinking I was crazy for running around with my dog like that. But I didn't care. All I cared about was that the bear was gone, my dog was safe, and I hadn't ended up as a bear's lunch. I walked back to the house, Lucy trotting happily beside me, looking like she'd just had the best time of her life. My mind was still racing, trying to process what had just happened. I still didn't quite believe it. A bear in town, and I had been right there, within feet of it, just narrowly avoiding disaster. The rest of the afternoon was a blur. Neighbors came by to check on me, to make sure I was okay, but I was still in shock. I didn't really know what to say. I couldn't shake the image of the bear leaping down from the tree, just inches away from me, or of chasing my dog around the yard like a madman, trying to keep her safe from something so much bigger and stronger than both of us. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off, and the reality of it all hit me. I was grateful that it hadn't turned into something much worse. Grateful that the bear had just been trying to get away, and that Lucy had been lucky. And grateful that I hadn't had to face down a bear with no fence, no shelter, no plan. I still can't quite believe it happened. I mean, I know it did, I was there. But a bear in town? I still don't know how it happened, or why. I guess I'll just chalk it up to living in a place where anything can happen. And I'll make sure the door locks from now on. I was about 12 or 13 years old. I can't remember exactly which. At that age, everything felt a bit hazy and awkward, like I didn't really belong anywhere. I liked walking, especially after dark. Things slowed down at night. The streets weren't empty, but they were quieter. Less judgmental, I guess. I could hear the wind in the trees, the dull hum of power lines, the way streetlights buzzed slightly if you got close enough. It felt safe, even peaceful. I didn't live in a rough area or anything like that. Just a plain, working-class neighborhood where everyone more or less kept to themselves. The sidewalks were cracked and uneven in spots, the fences chipped, the grass often overgrown. But it wasn't the kind of place where bad things were supposed to happen. That night, I was walking to my weekly psychiatrist appointment. It was a half-hour walk from my house, maybe a little longer if I dragged my feet, which I often did. I wasn't in any rush. The air was cool. There was still some dampness on the ground from earlier rain, and it smelled like wet earth and distant gas fumes. I remember watching my breath curl into the air as I walked. I was wearing my hoodie, hands in my pockets, head down, shoes tapping softly on the sidewalk. I'd been walking for about 15 minutes, close to halfway there, when I noticed a car rolling down the street behind me. I could hear the tires humming over the asphalt and the low rumble of the engine. I glanced back just for a second, not even fully turning my head. It was a Cadillac, kind of old and big and heavy looking, maybe late 90s or early 2000s. Nothing too fancy, but still flashy for our area. I didn't think anything of it at first. Then I heard them. Voices. Loud ones. Laughing, hooting, yelling stuff I couldn't quite make out at first. I turned my head and saw people leaning halfway out the windows, boys and girls, maybe 5 or 6 of them, all around 17 or 18, maybe early 20s. They were hanging out the windows like it was a party, shouting at me, making weird noises, calling me names. I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but I caught a few. "Hey loser, what are you doing, freak?" and stuff like that. They weren't just yelling, they were looking right at me, pointing, laughing in that way where it's not a joke, not funny, just mean. I looked straight ahead and kept walking. I didn't say anything. That's what I always did when people tried to mess with me. Don't give them anything to react to. Just keep moving, like I didn't hear them at all. That usually worked. The car passed and kept going. I figured that would be the end of it. Just some idiots looking to stir up drama. People like that had short attention spans. A minute or two later, I heard that same engine behind me again. I didn't even have to look to know it was the same car. Same laughter, same taunts. It had looped back around the block. They slowed down as they passed me this time, crawling along beside me for a few seconds before speeding off again. It wasn't funny anymore. It wasn't just teasing. It was deliberate. I felt a weird coldness start to settle in my chest. I told myself it was fine. Just ignore it. They'd get bored. People like that didn't stick with anything too long. But they came around again. This time they didn't even try to pretend it was a coincidence. They slowed down more, leaned out more, voices sharper and louder. I couldn't make out everything they said, but it felt more aggressive. One of them whistled. Another barked like a dog. One girl screamed something like, "What's wrong with you?" And they all laughed. The way they said it, it wasn't about me. It was about power, making me feel like I didn't belong, like I was something they found in the gutter and decided to poke at for fun. They turned the corner and were gone again. That's when I knew something wasn't right. I stopped walking and ducked into a yard. It was someone's house. There were these thick bushes behind a low black metal fence. One of those old fences that was more decorative than functional. I climbed over it quickly and crouched down behind the bushes. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I stayed still, holding my breath. Sure enough, the car came again, moving slower now. Creeping, almost. I could see it through the gaps in the bushes. The windows were down, but no one was shouting this time. They were looking, watching, trying to spot me. They passed right by. I waited. They turned the corner again, out of sight. I stayed hidden, heart thudding in my ears. I tried to count to 100, then again. I thought they were gone, thought maybe they'd given up. Maybe they thought I'd gone inside one of the houses. I didn't know how long I waited. Maybe 5 minutes. It felt longer. Eventually, I decided it was safe. I was wrong. I climbed back over the fence and started walking again, this time faster. Not quite running, but fast enough that I was practically speed walking. The streetlights cast long, stretched out shadows. My sneakers slapped the pavement louder now. I kept looking behind me. Then I heard them again. The car. The same one. That low rumble. The engine. The laughter. They'd spotted me again. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted toward the next block. I didn't even look both ways before crossing the street. I could hear the car turning, the tires squealing slightly. I knew I couldn't outrun a car, and I was scared they'd cut me off or jump out. I saw another apartment building and darted toward it. There was a small patch of grass and more bushes in front, thicker and taller than the last ones. I jumped the little fence and dropped behind the bushes, panting, knees burning from the run. I crouched there, trying to be as small and still as possible. I was just starting to catch my breath when the door to the apartment opened. I froze. A man stepped out. He saw me crouching there. At first, he looked confused, maybe thought I was up to something bad. He asked what I was doing. I panicked, but I managed to explain quickly, stumbling over my words. Told him I was on my way to a doctor's appointment, that I was being followed, that I didn't know them, that I was scared. He looked at me for a long second. Then he nodded, not saying much, just watching the street. He was older than me, maybe mid-30s or early 40s. Not huge, but solid. Broad shoulders. He wasn't wearing a shirt, just a white sleeveless undershirt, and I could see the muscle in his arms and chest. He had this quiet confidence, like someone who'd been through some stuff. That's when the car came again. It rolled up slowly, creeping to a stop right in front of us. It was quieter now. No shouting, just watching. I realized the car wasn't as full as before. There were empty seats, fewer heads leaning out the window. Something had changed. I looked around and saw 3 people walking from the other direction, on foot. Same age group, same voices. They'd been dropped off earlier, probably around the next block, and had been walking up the street to try and trap me. Me on one side, them on the other. Heard me toward the car. My stomach turned, but they saw I wasn't alone anymore. The man stepped forward slightly. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, just looked at them with this cold, hard stare. The kind of stare that tells you everything you need to know without a word. The guys walking toward us hesitated. Then one of them veered slightly and got in the car. The others followed. The car sat there for another few seconds. Then it pulled away. No tires squealing. No music. Just silence. Gone. The man watched them go. Then he turned and looked at me. He asked if I wanted to wait in his apartment until I felt safe, or if I wanted him to stay out there a little longer to make sure they didn't come back. I could still hear the nerves in my own voice when I told him no, thank you, but I'd keep going. I didn't want to be late. He nodded and went back inside. I stood there for a second after the door closed, staring at the number on the apartment door. Part of me wanted to knock again, just to be extra safe. But I didn't. I turned and started walking. Every shadow on the sidewalk made my heart race. Every car in the distance made me tense. But I didn't see them again. The Cadillac was gone. The voices were gone. When I got to my psychiatrist's office, I told him everything. I wasn't shaking anymore, but I was still on edge. He listened. He didn't brush it off. He said we should report it. He called the police. An officer showed up, asked questions, took notes. I told him everything I could remember about the car, the people in it, what happened. He nodded and wrote it all down. He said they'd look into it. That was the last I heard about it. After the appointment, I didn't walk home the usual way. I took side streets, cut through alleys, kept looking behind me. The streetlights felt too bright and too dim at the same time. I didn't see the Cadillac again. Didn't hear those voices. It was quiet. Eventually I got home. I told my parents I was fine. I didn't mention what happened. I don't know why. Maybe I just didn't want them to worry. That walk became different after that. I still went to my appointments. Still walked. But I never felt quite as peaceful during those walks. I still noticed the wind, the silence, the empty sidewalks. But now it felt like something else could be waiting in that quiet. Watching. Testing me. Sometimes I still think about that guy who came out of his apartment. The way he didn't ask too many questions. The way he just looked at them, and they backed off. I wonder what would have happened if he hadn't stepped outside at that exact moment. I think about how close I came to walking right into that trap. And every now and then, I pass that same spot, years later. The bushes are different now. Smaller. Trimmed down. You could barely hide a small dog behind them, let alone a scared kid. The fence is still there. The door to the apartment is still the same color. But everything else about that moment, what could have been, still feels vivid, still feels close. I got lucky, and I never saw that. I used to be left alone a lot as a kid. My mom would often spend the night at her boyfriend's house, leaving me to fend for myself. I never liked it, but I learned to get used to it. I didn't have much of a choice. It wasn't so bad at first. I had my routines, watched TV, played video games, read, whatever kept me distracted. But as the nights went on, things started feeling off. One night, it started like any other. I was in my room on the top floor of our house, lying on my bed, watching some random show. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet where every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows felt too loud. I had this strange sensation, like I wasn't alone. And then I heard it. A faint scuffling noise above me on the roof. It was soft at first, almost like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then it started getting louder, rhythmic, like someone was walking slowly across the roof. My heart started to race. I wasn't sure what I was hearing, but I knew it didn't sound right. It wasn't an animal. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded deliberate, heavy. I grabbed the phone next to my bed and dialed my mom's number, hands trembling. When she picked up, I was frantic, my voice breaking. "Mom, I think there's someone on the roof. I hear footsteps. Someone is walking on the roof, and I don't know what to do." There was a long pause, and then she sighed. "Sweetie, you're just imagining things. It's probably the wind or something. Just turn the TV up, and you'll be fine." Her tone was dismissive, like she wasn't taking me seriously. But I couldn't just ignore it. I turned the TV up as loud as I could, but the noise didn't stop. The footsteps continued, echoing above me. Every few seconds, the sound would shift, like whoever was up there was walking around, deliberately trying to make noise. I stayed awake that night, listening to the sound, my mind racing. I didn't know what to think anymore. Was I crazy? I didn't hear it during the day, only when I was alone at night in the quiet. It was always just me. But every time I heard it getting closer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone up there, watching me. This went on for weeks, months even. Every time my mom left for the night, I would hear the same footsteps. Every night, it was the same, me lying in bed, terrified, listening to someone walk on my roof. I called her again, once or twice, but each time, she dismissed it, telling me it was nothing, that I was just hearing things. By this point, I started to think maybe she really thought I was crazy. One night, though, I wasn't alone. My mom had her boyfriend over, and they were watching a movie downstairs while I stayed in my room. The usual silence settled in, and sure enough, I heard the footsteps again. But this time, I wasn't alone in my panic. My mom's boyfriend, the one who had never believed me, was sitting on the couch, barely paying attention to me when I ran downstairs to tell him about the noises. "Do you hear that?" I asked him urgently. "There's someone on the roof. It's happening again." He glanced at me, annoyed at first, but then his face changed. Maybe it was the panic in my eyes, or maybe it was just the desperation in my voice, but he finally stood up. Okay, let's go check it out." We stepped outside into the night, and I stood there, staring up at the roof. I could still hear it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps walking across the roof. My mom's boyfriend stood there, looking up with narrowed eyes. "All right, stay here. I'm going up there." I was about to protest, but before I could say anything, he grabbed a ladder from the side of the house and started climbing up. My heart pounded in my chest. I watched as he slowly ascended the ladder, then disappeared over the edge of the roof. I held my breath, listening intently for any sign of what was up there. I could hear him moving around, stepping lightly on the shingles. Then suddenly there was silence. My heart stopped for a beat, but before I could panic, I heard him call down to me. "There's nothing up here. I think you're just hearing things, kid." I didn't believe him. I could still hear it, the quiet steps, but now they were softer, almost like the thing on the roof was trying to hide from him. He muttered something about it being a raccoon or some animal, but I wasn't convinced. There was something about the way the footsteps sounded, something deliberate, almost like whoever, or whatever, was up there was aware of me, aware of my fear. But what could I do? My mom didn't believe me, and now her boyfriend didn't either. They both thought I was just imagining it. I was starting to doubt myself too. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe it was just some weird trick of the house, some wind or tree branch scraping across the roof. But then the noises started again. Months passed, and each time the footsteps came back, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't just imagining things. I was still hearing them, always when I was alone in the house. I started to stay up late, trying to catch whoever, or whatever, was doing it. I set up my own makeshift surveillance, sitting by the window, trying to peer into the darkness, but nothing ever showed itself. Just the sounds. Finally, one night, my mom heard it too. She was sitting in the living room, and I was upstairs in my room when it started again. The footsteps clearer now, loud enough to echo in the quiet house. This time, she didn't brush me off. She called out to me, "Is that what you've been hearing?" I nodded, unable to speak. We both sat there, listening to the steps move across the roof. It wasn't an animal. I knew that now. I wasn't crazy. But what was it? "Well, we need to figure this out," my mom said. She sounded shaken. "Maybe it's a mouse or something. A rat. I don't know." So we went to work. We set up traps. First, mouse traps. The next morning, they were gone, stolen, taken without a trace. It didn't make sense. How could a mouse take a trap? We tried again. Rat traps this time. The next day, the traps were empty. No rats. No mice. Just an empty trap. Frustrated, we moved on to something bigger, small animal bear claw traps, the kind you use for larger animals. We set them on the roof and waited. The next morning, we found the food had been taken, but the traps were untouched. Not a single one had been triggered. Now, we were starting to get scared. I wasn't imagining things. Something was up there. So we decided to check the roof. We found the hole, a small gap between the ceiling and the roof, just big enough for something to slip through. We closed it up, thinking we'd finally solve the problem. But that night, there was a storm. A thunderstorm, the kind where the sky rips apart and lightning streaks across the heavens. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, listening to the rain when I saw it. My cat, sitting at the edge of the room, staring at the ceiling. His eyes were wide, fixed on something. He didn't move, didn't even blink. I followed his gaze, my heart starting to race. Just then, my mom's boyfriend walked in, chewing tobacco as he always did. He looked up at the ceiling, then at me. "What are you two staring at?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was frozen in place, just like my cat. But he didn't hesitate. "I think the creature's trying to get out," he said, his voice rough. I wasn't sure what he meant, but when I looked back at the ceiling, I realized something was moving up there, something large. Something trying to get out. Without another word, my mom's boyfriend grabbed a bat and a bottle of Jack Daniels and went outside, ready to confront whatever was up there. I watched him climb up onto the roof, his footsteps heavy in the night air. It was the most surreal moment of my life. I was sure I was going to see something terrible. He reached the top and stopped. I heard him speak, his voice a bit shaky. "There's something up here, all right," he muttered. "But it's not what I expected." And that's when I heard it, The eyes. He saw them first. Two glowing, yellow eyes glaring down at him from the roof. They were covered by a black mask, completely still, watching him. For a long moment, he just stood there. The creature didn't move, and neither did he. But eventually, the thing on the roof seemed to decide that it had enough of this game. It stopped trying to break out, the eyes disappearing into the shadows. The next few days were a blur. My mom's boyfriend had made it clear that whatever it wasn't normal. We found evidence of it, scratches on the roof, broken shingles. But we knew we had to deal with it. And we did. We set up more traps. But this time, the creature was too clever. It was gone. Months later, I was heading up to my room, thinking about everything that had happened. As I opened the door, I noticed something odd. My light was off. I was the kind of kid who always forgot to turn the light off. I walked into my room and turned on the light. There, sitting on my desk, was a gigantic raccoon. My heart stopped. Another one. How did it get in? I didn't know what to do. I turned to run down the stairs, my mind racing. My mom and her boyfriend heard me and rushed up. They both burst into laughter. They couldn't stop laughing. My mom's boyfriend, the taxidermist, was the first to speak. "That's your creature, huh?" he said between fits of laughter. "The one that nearly drove you insane." I stared at him, completely dumbfounded. It was the raccoon, the one I had imagined all this time, the one that had haunted me for months. It was real, but not in the way I thought. I kept the raccoon for several years. It was stuffed, lifelike, sitting in my room as a reminder of everything I had gone through. Eventually, I donated it to some neighbor boys when I moved out of my apartment. They didn't know the story, but they were thrilled to have it. And in a strange way, so was I. It felt like closing a chapter of my life. But I'll never forget the footsteps on the roof, the terror of hearing something above me that wasn't supposed to be there. That feeling, that sense that something was lurking just out of sight, will stick with me forever.